Abdl Story Part 1. He really didn't want to do this, but he felt that he had to. He took another step toward her, so that he was now within an arm's reach of her. She said, "You can go ahead and pull those jeans down." Hands trembling, he moved to obey her, fumbling with his belt. Slowly he undid his belt, unbuckled and unzipped his jeans, and let them slide to the floor, revealing his bulky disposable diaper underneath. "Okay, let's go," she said a bit impatiently, indicating her lap. It always took too long the first time. When he hesitated, she reached up and firmly grasped his ear, causing him to yelp with pain. She pulled him roughly down and felt the familiar plastic of a disposable diaper settle on her lap. Doug suddenly found himself staring at the floor, and feeling very helpless. "Is this diaper dirty?" he heard her ask him, for what would not be the last time. "No," he whimpered feebly. "Good," she said. "Now grab the chair legs with your hands, and don't let go. I don't want to have to fight your hands up here. If you let go, we start again from the beginning. Got it?" "Yes," came the weak reply. Her voice was so calm, in contrast to how he felt. He reluctantly grasped the chair legs with his hands. Then he heard his diaper being untaped, and suddenly felt a breeze meet his bare bottom. He was scared. His bottom was so vulnerable. He now remembered his childhood spankings, and how helpless he'd felt then. He cursed himself for ever having fantasized about them. Smack. The first slap was surprisingly painful, but he had no time to think about it. Her hand came down again and again, more quickly than he could process. And to his surprise, Doug found himself crying almost immediately, probably as much due to his being upset about the whole situation as to the painful spanking. It hurt, and it was so humiliating. But he kept his hands on the chair legs like a good boy, because he didn't want to risk the consequences. And shortly, Mrs. Warren stopped spanking him. His crying faded into sniffles. Was that it? It hadn't lasted as long as he'd feared. It was bad, but it could have been worse. He could almost handle this. "Doug, why are you getting this spanking?" he heard from above him. "I don't know." Smack. "Yes, you do, and call me Mommy." "Because I didn't shave myself, Mommy." He felt her rub his bottom. That felt good. "That's right. Good boy." He let out a deep breath, relieved it was over. "I like to make sure my bad little boys know why they're getting their spankings. We can keep going now." And he felt her reach down, saw the purse in his peripheral vision. She seemed to retrieve something, but he couldn't see what it was. Suddenly it wasn't her hand caressing his bottom, but something smooth and cool. A brush? A paddle? This couldn't be good. When the spanking resumed, the pain was sharper, but the sounds of impact had changed. Doug learned that his trial was not nearly over yet. And he cried again, out of pain and the frustration of being helpless. Twice more she stopped to have him repeat why he was being spanked, and twice more they resumed. It seemed to go on forever, far longer than he'd expected, and it hurt more than anything he could remember. His bottom burned and stung intensely. Finally she stopped, saying, "Will you remember to shave under your diaper now, little boy?" Gasping, Doug replied, "Yes. Yes, Mommy." "Good boy. Would you like Mommy to shave you now?" "Yes, Mommy," he sobbed, hoping that was the answer she wanted to hear. "All right, let's go upstairs." And she stood him up, folding his diaper in one hand. His hands went immediately to his stinging bottom. "No, no, young man," Mrs. Warren said, brushing his hands down. "That's a no-no. We don't touch our bottoms after our spanking, because that makes it feel better. We want it to hurt for as long as possible, don't we? That way we keep thinking about what a bad little boy we were. Okay. No touching." He choked back tears. "Yes, Mommy." He hated her, but was desperate at this moment to stay on her good side. He kept his hands away from his throbbing bottom. She led him upstairs to the bathtub, which she filled with warm water. At her instruction, he lowered himself into the water carefully. He was happy to find that, in the water, his rear end didn't hurt. But it wouldn't have mattered. He was going to be good. He didn't ever want another spanking as long as he lived. He watched as she found some shaving lotion and a razor and lathered up his groin. He bit his lip as she shaved away his pubic hair, starting at the top and moving down around his penis and scrotum. He stayed very still, because he didn't like something sharp so close to him like that. But she was quite adept with the razor, and he imagined she'd had lots of practice. With a sure hand, she easily took away this vestige of his adulthood, and he looked down in amazement at his bald crotch. It looked so strange. He lay back and lifted his legs, as instructed, and she continued down around his bottom. Doug idly wondered how long his hair would take to grow back, but he needn't have. It wouldn't be an issue for a long time. When they were done, he let her lead him back into his bedroom, where she diapered him for the first time. She did it tenderly, stroking and rubbing him gently. It felt good, he had to admit. He fought feelings of affection for her as she did this, but it was hard. She was so gentle and loving as she covered him with lotion and powder, lots of powder, and then taped him securely in. It actually felt nice, though he tried to ignore this. This was the same lady who had just spanked him. His ambivalence frustrated him. Afterward, she picked up the copy of the rules that he had laying by the bed. Why didn't I read those? He asked himself again, and led him, wearing nothing but his diaper, downstairs to the sofa, where she read the rules out loud to him, like a bedtime story. See rules. Official ICP rules. Welcome to your new life. Welcome to your Incontinence Control Program, ICP. The philosophy of our program is based on the idea that continence comes first. As you know, continence is one of the very first skills you learn, and is a prerequisite to successful functioning in our society. If you are incontinent, whether you are a baby learning for the first time, or someone like yourself who needs to start over from the beginning, controlling incontinence and regaining continence should take precedence over all other aspects of your life. Otherwise, everything else in your life will suffer. Our program is successful because it helps you properly prioritize your incontinence, which is the first step toward controlling and, later, eliminating this embarrassing problem. There are 3 essential elements to your personal ICP. First, as is true with any problem, the most important step is admitting from the start that you have a problem. Many of our incontinent clients have trouble admitting that they have trouble with such a basic issue as keeping their pants dry or clean. After all, even small children master keeping their pants clean and dry. To help you face up to this very real problem, we force you to confront your incontinence continually via the wearing and usage of adult-sized baby diapers. They are a visible and tactile symbol of your inability to stay clean and dry. The day-to-day care of your diapers and diaper area, as well as the difficulty you will face in hiding them from other people, will constantly remind you that you do indeed have a childish problem which needs prompt and constant attention. The second part of your ICP is control, the literal center of your program's name. You were enrolled in this program, at least in part, because of a demonstrated habit of wetting or messing in your pants or bed. You do not need to be told how embarrassing wet or messy pants can be around other people. Even one accident has the potential to ruin relationships, job opportunities, and other critical aspects of your life. Repeated accidents almost guarantee social and business ostracism. To help you salvage the rest of your life before it is permanently damaged, we offer, via Diapers, a foolproof method of preventing these all too visible accidents. And while having the occasional person find out that you wear diapers might seem embarrassing to you, it does not even come close to approximating the devastating effects of an unprotected accident in public. Wearing a diaper tells the people that do find out about them that you are aware of, are responsible for, and are taking effective actions against these repulsive social gaffes. It may very well impress them. The third principle of our program is essential and, at the same time, often painful: discipline. It is, however, the cornerstone of your hope to regain your continence, and it must take priority right from the outset. We involve discipline in our program in many different ways. For example, we know that it's difficult to submit to the embarrassment of wearing diapers all the time. But the very act of trying to live with this embarrassment is excellent disciplinary training. So is maintaining good diaper hygiene on a daily basis. And so is following the list of rules which follows, and submitting to punishment when appropriate. Punishment can play a small or large role in our ICPs, depending on your dedication to the ICP rules. It is primarily designed to instill discipline, which is often lacking in clients like yourself. It may be, in fact, the lack of such discipline which has led to your inability to remain toilet trained. Your participation in this program will hopefully lead you to develop the kind of discipline that will allow you to begin the second stage of your ICP, your continence retraining program. But that's a long way off in the future. For now, we simply want you to concentrate on your ICP. As you can see, with diapers and discipline, we can help you face your incontinence problem, control embarrassing accidents, and create a foundation of discipline upon which you can build for years to come. This is the philosophy of our program here at TIC. It has proven to be very effective both in controlling our clients' incontinence and also in maintaining participation in our program over the long run, an area where other programs often fall short. How long will you be in your ICP? This is a question often asked but difficult to answer. People vary in the severity of their incontinence problems and in their attitude about their ICPs. Not cooperating with us will delay your progression toward getting off of probation and moving toward retraining. Since the critical goal is for you to achieve a certain level of discipline and control, there is no upper limit to how long you may have to stay in your ICP. You have signed a legal contract to participate in your ICP, and this binds you to continue with us until the TIC person in charge of your care and training, your TIC mommy, believes you are ready to move on. And this depends entirely on you and how you respond to your ICP. Cooperation makes TIC very happy, and you will move that much more quickly toward being able to use a toilet and wearing underpants again. Think of that. It certainly is something to work toward. So read these rules carefully and refer to them often. Post the mini-list at the end in several prominent places around your home, to help you remember how to be a good boy. Good luck, and be good. Diapers, your assigned diaper, to be supplied to you by your TIC mommy, is to be worn by you at all times. This means 24 hours per day, everywhere you go, for example. While sleeping, to school, to work, on errands, to doctor's appointments, to the beach, etc. While embarrassment about wearing your diaper is common and natural, it is very important to wear one at all times. The only exceptions are that you may briefly remove your diaper for changing purposes or for baths, showers. Try to make the time you spend out of your diaper for these purposes as brief as possible, while still maintaining good diaper area hygiene. To help you remember to wear your diaper constantly, we have by this time, or will have in the near future, removed all your big boy underpants from your home, and you will not be allowed to own any in the future, until such time as you are continent again. You may think of wearing underpants as a privilege to be earned, just as if you were a small child. To be allowed to wear your underpants again, you need to demonstrate a high level of continence skill. Note, many pools and beaches forbid infants in diapers to swim in the water. This includes you, and so even though it is inconvenient, we ask you to obey these signs where they are posted. Rules are there to be obeyed. Discipline, especially during your initial probation period, you will be checked often to be sure you are wearing your diaper. Your TIC mommy will have a key and permission to enter your home, and may enter unannounced up to several times a day, including overnight, to make sure you are being a good boy. School and work schedules will be furnished to your TIC mommy, and you will notify her of dates and errands, so that she may check on you during these times outside your home as well. For specific disciplinary measures, see below under Discipline. Toilet versus diaper usage. For the foreseeable future, until your TIC mommy tells you differently, you are to use your diaper for all your bowel and bladder needs. This means that you are not to use any toilet at all until you are told that it is okay to do so. Unauthorized toilet usage will be met with severe penalties from your TIC mommy. At your home, we help you by preventing toilet usage completely, usually by turning off, draining, and locking all of your home's toilets. We add urine-sensitive blue dye to the remaining toilet water, and your TIC mommy will check the toilets, every day at first, to make sure that you have been good. If you live with roommates or a spouse who needs to use the toilets, we will either give them other special dyes, or keys to unlock the toilets, and they will be asked to take an active role in preventing you from using them. Public and guest restrooms elsewhere cannot be similarly equipped, of course, but remember that TIC mommies usually know where their TIC babies are, and almost always have an eye on them wherever they are. They may follow them personally, or hire other friendly babysitters to keep their eyes on you while you are at work or out shopping. Be aware that even suspicious loitering around a public restroom, let alone going in, may be grounds for serious punishment. In the interest of avoiding painful misunderstandings, please stay away from these areas and simply use your diaper appropriately. The other way in which you are encouraged to use your diapers is through the recollection of use diapers. As you take off a wet or messy diaper, wrap it up and place it in the bag placed in your diaper pail by your TIC mommy. At the end of each week, when your new diapers are delivered, we will pick up your bags of used diapers for you. TIC counts them and compares the total for the week with your quota, which is set by your TIC mommy. This number will be calculated to estimate your weekly diaper needs at full usage. Therefore, if you turn in fewer than your quota, we know you've used a toilet and or not worn your diaper all the time. This, of course, necessitates punishment. Please note the following as well. Your quota includes a total minimum number of diapers, in addition to specifically a minimum number of messy diapers for the week. This minimum number of messy diapers is usually 9 diapers per week, or just over 1 messy diaper each day. Each diaper must be fully used, i.e. the wetness indicator in disposables greater than 2/3 wet. This includes messy diapers. Diapers are tested by TIC for genuineness of urine with special chemical tests. These tests can determine if you've doctored a diaper, for example, added water, peed onto it while not wearing it, etc. Extensive experience allows us to easily identify these diapers and the bad little boys who try to mislead us, and punishment for this infraction is particularly severe. Not meeting diaper quotas will obviously lead to punishment and or help. See below. Hygiene. Diaper hygiene is extremely important in preventing diaper rash, which will make you very uncomfortable, and which often requires embarrassing trips to see the doctor. It is also a good way to practice your discipline, and to prove to your TIC mommy that you are a responsible and disciplined client. Hygiene includes shaving. It is expected that you will keep your diaper area, i.e. all hair on skin that is covered by your diaper, closely shaven at all times. TIC mommies will begin checking your diaper area within 24 hours from when you start your ICP to make sure you are well shaven. We recommend that you shave yourself every 2 to 3 days to keep yourself clean and comfortable. Shaving makes messy cleanups much easier, and provides less area for diaper rash to fester. Your TIC mommy hates to see hair down there. She will check you often to see that your skin is as smooth now as it was during your first infancy. Showers, baths. We recommend showers or bubble baths every day. Many clients enjoy showering right after removing a messy diaper, to help them clean up. This is fine as long as you keep your bathtub shower well cleaned from day to day. Your TIC mommy will check this. During showers or baths, you are expected to wash your diaper area very thoroughly, including both orifices. These are areas with very sensitive skin which must be kept clean. Diaper changes, since you must use every diaper fully, which often means wearing a diaper long after it has been initially wet or dirted. It is critical that you use Vaseline, lotions, and/or powder to keep your skin in good shape. It is generally up to you to choose what combination you like the best, though your TIC mommy may have some special rules or suggestions for you. She will also provide you with any and all supplies you may need for this purpose. Sex. By enrolling in this program, you have promised not to engage in any sexual activity until after your restored continence has been documented and your participation in your ICP has been terminated. The parameters of this rule should be clear, but we have found it necessary in the past to elaborate on this point. Sexual activity for boys means any situation which involves an erection or orgasm ejaculation. In other words, you are not allowed to ejaculate while in this program. This includes sex with other people as well as masturbation. The reasons for this are simple and important. It is a matter of priority. Incontinence control requires full concentration all day long, every day. Since boys use the same part of their bodies for urination as for sex, some boys become confused and/or preoccupied when faced with the opportunity to use their penises for more than one purpose. You need your full energy and concentration in order to return to full continence, and anything, like sex, which takes your mind off this process, is counterproductive. At TIC, we believe there is another benefit to abstaining from sex while in the program. We like to use it as an incentive to cooperate with us in restoring your lost control. It fits in with the rest of the program. Think of it as though you are a little boy who is growing up slowly. Parents use the promise of underpants as inducement toward continence. We use this as well, plus the promise of once again being able to enjoy the grown-up pleasures of sex. Babies don't have sex, and while you are in diapers, neither will you. We know, however, that boys like you have trouble controlling their strong sexual urges, so we have devised several ways to help. First, we obtain agreements from significant others not to participate in sexual activity with you, to actively discourage you from engaging in any activity, and to report any suspected or witnessed activity to us directly, so that we may help you in avoiding such activity in the future. Second, we try to eliminate opportunities and the temptation for you to indulge in these naughty acts when you are alone, via several ways. You must always wear your diaper, as already mentioned. All diapers are meticulously tested chemically for ejaculate, for example, semen, sperm, etc., when turned in. All disposable paper products are removed from your home permanently. You have no need for toilet paper, and other needs, such as Kleenex or paper towels, can be satisfied with cloth products like handkerchiefs or towels. All laundry is examined carefully by your TIC mommy before you are allowed to wash it. You are not allowed to touch yourself between the legs, even through your diapers, for any purpose other than cleaning, and these times are to be kept brief. Because some boys have demonstrated extreme resourcefulness in deceiving us, chemicals have been added to your sinks and bathtub shower which will turn bright red if these surfaces come into contact with any ejaculate. These chemicals are permanent and are impossible to remove. This has been tried, and trust us, it does not work. Breaking the sex prohibition is treated very harshly, with both punitive and preventative measures often being taken. We believe strongly that sexual activity must be avoided by you at all costs, and we will work with you to eliminate these acts if they become a problem. This is a supreme example of how discipline plays a role in your ICP. If you believe you may have a problem with masturbation or other naughty activities in the future, please discuss this with your TIC mommy from the outset, so that we may prevent any problems from occurring. Discipline, as one of the central tenets in your ICP, discipline is obviously very important. In addition to the aforementioned role it plays in successful continence, it plays a large role in encouraging your active participation in this program as well. Discipline comes in two varieties in your ICP: self-imposed, the kind we want you to develop for yourself, and externally imposed, in the form of punishment. Both of these types, if you have not already encountered them, will become very familiar to you in the near future. When we sat down to devise the punishments we thought would be most helpful to you in developing your discipline, we decided to focus on what would be most meaningful to you in your ICP. In keeping with the idea that you are starting from the beginning again, for example, wearing diapers, looking forward to toilet training, etc., we thought that a most infantile punishment, the spanking, might be most appropriate. It not only reminds you of your infantile incontinence, but it will reinforce your relationship with your TIC mommy, which ought to be that of a mother-toddler. There should be an element of nurturing and caretaking, but also an element of strict discipline as well. This mother-toddler relationship is a perfect analogy of what we think will work best. After all, nature uses it every day to teach continence the first time. The following list includes brief glimpses of some of the more common punishments doled out by mommies in the past. It is certainly not exclusive, and mommies have the liberty to devise and use nearly any sort of punishment if they think it will help you improve your self-discipline. The only limitations are that we ask TIC mommies to tone down punishment in public, unless necessary, and we forbid any punishment that might lead to permanent physical injury. Spankings, these are often the straightforward and old-fashioned type, with you being bare-bottomed and over your TIC mommy's knee, given with an open hand. However, they are subject to modification by inventive mommies. In certain circumstances they may be given in public, see below, but usually are given in the privacy of your home. Given for a wide variety of offenses, including not wearing your diapers, poor hygiene, not shaving, backtalk, disobeying your mommy, touching yourself, having an unauthorized orgasm, being spotted near a public restroom, and going on errands without first telling your TIC mommy. Spankings are usually given without warnings beforehand, so if you have a doubt about whether you might be breaking a rule, ask. The wet bet, this is a favorite of our mommies, so look out. TIC mommies love to visit their babies in public places and check to see if they are wearing their diapers by challenging them with the wet bet. It is not to be feared by good little boys who always wear their diapers, but it can become quite an embarrassing or painful problem for naughty little boys caught without their diapers on. In the wet bet, your mommy will bet you that you are wearing your diaper, and will then ask you to wet it for her. Good boys wind up with a wet diaper that simply needs changing, but bad boys end up with very wet pants in very public places. Refusing to take the bet leads to an immediate spanking wherever you happen to be at the time. You are told about this at the beginning so that you are not tempted to go without your diaper in public. You will be asked to take the wet bet, so be good and always wear your diaper. Bowel encouragement, this is not so much a punishment as an old-fashioned medicinal treatment. If you fail to turn in your required quota of messy diapers for the week, you force your mommy to conclude that you are constipated and need a little help moving your bowels. This is most often accomplished using the suppository series, wherein your mommy encourages you to move your bowels by giving you a series of powerful suppositories in sequential diapers during a 24-hour period. Each diaper must be worn until your mommy thinks the suppository has done its job fully, and then you may be changed and given a fresh suppository. We find this treatment to be very effective, and often one series is the only such treatment any one client ever needs to help keep him regular and obedient. Humiliation, as mentioned, driving home your infantile status is effective both in reminding you of your underlying problem and in reinforcing your relationship with your mommy. Humiliation, both formally and informally, is often used by our mommies to emphasize what they feel is undisciplined or immature behavior. Being forced to eat baby food, or to use bibs, bottles, baby talk, and baby clothing and furniture often makes the point very clearly to our clients. Each mommy has her own favorite ways of embarrassing you, so be warned now. Avoiding this treatment, or escaping it once it has started, is only accomplished by accepting your punishment like a big boy and following all the rules, i.e., growing up in your mommy's eyes. Some of this humiliation inevitably occurs in public, but you can minimize this by being as good as possible. Wearing diapers is embarrassing, we know. Don't make things any worse. MISC. Our mommies have your permission to use other forms of corporal, psychological, and diaper punishment on you at any time if it is felt appropriate and abides by the rules outlined above. A final word: no one is perfect, so you can expect to be punished, probably many times, over the duration of your ICP. We have yet to meet an ICP boy who doesn't need an occasional spanking, or who isn't better behaved afterward. Of course, we also have yet to meet an ICP boy who thinks he needs the spanking. We wouldn't expect any less. Boys are boys, after all. How often will you be spanked? That is entirely up to you. Nobody likes to be punished, but our goal is to try to help you become more responsible and disciplined, and your punishment will help you move closer toward getting out of your diapers and back into underpants. It might be difficult to recall how good the punishment is for you when you are perched on a lap sunny side up, or if you are forced to wet your pants in public, or spend an entire day in a very messy diaper, but if you can learn anything from it, it is worthwhile. Admit your mistake, accept your punishment, learn from it, and move on. Probation: you are automatically on probation when you begin your ICP. While on probation, you are subject to very close supervision and very strict discipline. Visits from your mommy to home and in public are frequent, and punishment is more severe. Its duration may vary in length from several weeks to several years, in the worst case, depending on your cooperation and attitude. Your mommy will take you off of probation when she is convinced that you will unfalteringly adhere to the rules and the philosophy of your ICP. Most clients initially appreciate this attention to detail, but we view getting off probation as one of the initial signs that you may be developing enough discipline to merit terminating your ICP and beginning toilet retraining. Termination: because our punishment often generates strong temporary urges to terminate participation in the ICP, we have made exit from an ICP relatively difficult, at the request of our clients. However, continence is the skill by which everyone in this program is judged, and if you demonstrate perfect continence, you may terminate your ICP. Our anticipation is that you will not regain continence until after finishing your ICP and undergoing our intense second step of the program, the continence retraining program. You can take the shortcut, however, if you satisfy one of two criterion. A. Pass a continence test given to you by your TIC mommy. The use of mild diaper juice during a 3-hour continence test has been proved to be a reliable differentiator between who needs to be in our program and who does not. B. Get a signed note from an impartial physician testifying to your total continence of bowel and bladder. This is an available option only after 6 months of an ICP, since this is the established minimally therapeutic time in our program. Your TIC mommy will furnish you with a list of TIC-recognized physicians eligible to evaluate your continence status. Your mommy may ask you to obey certain other rules, and she, of course, has every authority to impose them on you. It is difficult to follow an ICP correctly all the time, but TIC has a proven history of effective incontinence control. Your full cooperation makes our job easier and your life more enjoyable. Good luck, and be a good boy. Mini list of rules. To be posted in prominent places in your home. Always wear your diapers. Use them and them alone for all of your potty needs. Keep yourself clean and shaven. Use your diapers completely, and save them in your diaper pail for your TIC mommy. Never touch yourself in naughty ways or have any sort of sexual activity. Always do what your TIC mommy tells you to do. Accept your punishment and try to learn from it. Love your mommy, she's here to help. As he listened to the introduction, he fought the tendency to buy into the philosophy. But it sounded almost reasonable to him, and he wondered if they really did care about him and about helping him. But then again, it was so perverse. How could it be on the level? It was so extremely humiliating, he thought, to be lumped in with people who wet their pants or their beds, and to be treated like he was a baby. And how could they think this would really help him? They couldn't be serious. This wasn't a joke or a game. They really were going to treat him like a baby, on purpose, because they said he deserved it. The whole thing, working toward wearing underpants again, made him feel so infantile. It really was stupid, he decided, not helpful. They couldn't fool him. Other thoughts that ran through his mind as Mrs. Warren read what was to become his Bible for the foreseeable future involved how he could fake compliance with these rules. There had to be flaws he could find. He was smart, and he had to be able to figure it out. Unfortunately, Mrs. Warren was smart, too, maybe even smarter, and she appeared experienced at this job. As she read the diaper rules, he saw how smart she was. Testing diapers seemed like a lot of work for her. But if they really did it, that neutralized many of his first disobedient ideas. He wondered if they really did do it, and how. He was trying to think about how he could fake using the diapers, peeing into them without really wearing them, etc., when his new mommy told him how her inspectors look for wetting patterns like splattering that gives away bad babies. Wet diapers have to look right, she said, which is impossible without wearing them. He became even more dismayed about the messy diaper quota and rules. He didn't look forward to having to fully use his messy diapers. That meant wearing them for a while after he pooped, right? Being forced to wear messy diapers was gross, and would significantly add to his clean-up time. Using a shower would help, but what if he was away from home? The part about avoiding public bathrooms struck him as being impossible to enforce. Then he remembered how she had gone over with him his shopping and banking habits. She really would know where he was all the time. But seriously, who would be watching? He also had to call her whenever he left his apartment to go out. Doug could just leave a message on her cellular phone mail, so she could keep track of him all the time. But Mrs. Warren said she had other clients. How did she keep track of all of them? He thought that maybe this was an opportunity. He'd have to keep it in mind. It was when they got to the sex prohibition that he really got depressed. From the moment she read him the rules, he knew he'd never be able to follow them. He could nearly accept being forced to live his secret fetish and ultimate fantasy. It was painful, confining, and humiliating, but at least it was his fetish. He was even now feeling strong sexual urges, and it was these that he thought would make this lifestyle palatable. But no sex. No masturbation. He couldn't imagine. He now did that daily, and that was without a diaper in contact with him. Being sentenced to be in perpetual contact with his fetish object but never being allowed to climax, this was the best description of hell he could think of. He couldn't live with that rule. He'd either have to get out of the program, which he was still determined to do, or figure out some way of getting around it. But his heart sunk as he listened to her precautions. He didn't know where he could hide the evidence if his diapers, tissues, laundry, and tub sinks were off limits. Could she really test all of these? That red dye sounded fake. And what if he smuggled home some tissues and then threw them away back at work? His mind wandered as she read him about his discipline. Spankings, and some wet thing, messy diapers, blah, blah, blah. How had this happened to him? It had only taken 4 days for his life to be ruined by 2 women. He'd just wanted some diapers for this week, for a little kinky fun. Now, he was living a nightmare, forced back into an embarrassing toddlerhood filled with spankings and diapers. He had just allowed himself to be spanked and shaved. He felt so degraded. How could this be real? But the alternatives were even worse, he told himself. At least this way, the rest of his life was still intact, and if he could somehow still get out of this program, nothing would be lost. He was still on target for his high-prestige life of research and academia, somewhere in the future. His dream was still intact, even if he had to sacrifice a little more for a few days or weeks to achieve it. Doug's attention was refocused when she started talking about termination of the program. Another continence test, which he didn't want to think about, or a trip to a doctor. That would be embarrassing, sure, but at least it couldn't be tampered with. At least here was a foolproof way out, if everything else failed and 6 months from now he was still in diapers. This made him feel better, there was an upper limit to this madness. At the most, this surreal distraction would end in 6 months, and then he could return to his life. Mrs. Warren finished her little dramatic reading and helped him tape up copies of The Minimalist all over his apartment. She then assured him she'd be back often in the next few days and nights to check on him. After a fond little pat on his diapered behind, she left. Doug watched his mommy drive away in her pink pastel diaper van, and snaked his hands down the back of his diaper, finally able to rub his still sore bottom in peace. Abdl Story, Part 7. When Doug had spent several minutes soothing his hot, red bottom, he sat down in stunned amazement to consider what his life had suddenly been turned into. He thought of the mounds of diapers up in his room, destined to be worn and used by him in the near future. He thought of being forced to call Mrs. Warren Mommy, and essentially forced to do anything she told him to do. It was so humiliating. How could he possibly live with this? But what could he do? He asked himself. He told himself over and over that he had no choice. That it didn't matter how he got here and what he thought about it. He simply had to play baby now, or risk losing the rest of his life. It was unfair and miserable, but he had to be realistic. It was his only option if he didn't want to be the laughingstock of his family, friends, and colleagues. He stared down at the bulky diaper he had sentenced himself to wear. Because he had gotten cute and self-righteous over the phone with Mrs. Sheffield, he was now going to wear the thickest, loudest diaper ever. It would undoubtedly be noticeable, and even more embarrassing was how much he had contributed to this situation. If he hadn't gone into the store, if he hadn't lied about being incontinent, if he hadn't lied about wanting such an unmanageable diaper, if he hadn't agreed to the incontinence test, there were so many ways he could have avoided this, he thought. But at every step, he'd made the wrong move, and now he was stuck. Stuck in a diaper so thick he wasn't sure he could even masturbate through it, even if that was allowed. But, of course, he had been operating under the assumption that this was a game of which he had control. He now knew differently, but it was too late. This diaper service was a business, and a serious one at that. And he had just contracted them to enslave him in diapers. He snorted. It sounded like a dream come true. But at least according to how his bottom felt right now, it was closer to a nightmare. He had to take this situation day by day. If he tried to deal with the whole thing, he'd get too depressed. But if he only thought about the next day, he could get through. Tomorrow wouldn't be too bad. In fact, this week wouldn't be too embarrassing, since he was studying at home alone. This was almost what he had intended for this week, anyway. No one had to know. Next week would be interesting, though, when he went back to work. How would he ever keep his co-workers in the dark? Bulky clothes, he mused. His real life would be quite a challenge. For the next day, though, his job was easy. Study as much as possible from his GRE review book, and, in the words of Mrs. Warren, be a good little boy. He actually didn't care how ridiculous that sounded. Right now, and for as long as his bottom kept hurting, he was happy to wear his diaper compliantly, and do anything else he needed to. He wasn't interested in risking another spanking right now. Doug was surprised to find his diarrhea clearing up fairly quickly that afternoon. Mrs. Warren was right again, he thought. He didn't like to admit it, but she seemed to know everything. And as his diarrhea slowed, he noticed that his diaper consumption was slowing as well. He thought about this idly during dinner. He would have to worry about this diaper quota. He calculated his usage for the week at his new, slower rate, and realized he'd be hard-pressed to wet enough diapers. And if he didn't, he knew what awaited him. So he began to drink more that evening. This, he only half noticed, had the effect desired by Mrs. Warren, of his spending more and more time in partially wet diapers, as he conscientiously waited to saturate them fully. By the next day, Thursday, Doug was consciously starting to relax his sphincter control, wetting whenever he felt the urge. His diapers held almost anything, and as long as he had the opportunity to relax and not worry about control, why not? At this point, it wasn't like it was important whether he tried to hold it back or not. The rules didn't reward him for that. So who needs it? If I have to be a baby, I might as well take advantage of it, he thought. It's the only perk of this stupid situation, after all. On Thursday, for the first time, Doug felt the need for the first time to have a real, formed BM. This was another little landmark for him, since it involved using his diaper for an optional mess. It wasn't like the diarrhea, where he was controlling an emergent situation. It also necessitated wearing the diaper for some time afterward, since he hadn't wet in it yet. It usually felt good, but today, as he squished around in his full pants, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being forced to do this, to wear his poop-filled diaper. Mrs. Warren was making him do this, and for some reason that made it less fun. Mrs. Warren stopped by occasionally and was pleased when she checked Doug's diaper pail, toilets, and tub. She acknowledged his good behavior with a sticker on his refrigerator, about which she said he should be proud. He found it difficult to get excited about a sticker. It was just one more embarrassing element to this absurd program. Mrs. Warren had expected this good behavior. It was typical of her new boys for the first few days, what she called the honeymoon period. Their bottoms still stung, and the potential humiliation of the photos was still fresh in their minds. They also weren't yet bored with the program, and hadn't had enough time to build up a huge amount of sexual tension. This would all change, she knew. Doug did come up with some questions for Mrs. Warren, however, as he found minor problems with the ICP. How, for example, was he supposed to blow his nose if she had forbidden all paper products from his apartment? It was easily solved, Mrs. Warren said, by using an old-fashioned handkerchief, which, like his other laundry, was to be inspected by her before he took it to the complex's laundry room. Working out details to another problem, Doug agreed to shave himself every other day to keep his bottom and groin smooth. On Friday, he did this for the first time, and found that it wasn't too difficult, except for his ego. Saturday was the day of his big test, and, knowing this, Mrs. Warren showed up at his apartment early in the morning to see him off. She presented him with a large, pink pastel diaper bag, which he was not so pleased to receive. It was so frilly and infantile that it could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. He pled his case to her that it was just too embarrassing to take out in public, but Mrs. Warren said that it was more important to be prepared properly than to be socially comfortable, and she therefore wouldn't accept his excuses. This brought up an issue Doug hadn't considered before. Surely there would be times when he'd have to change himself in public, but how was this possible if he wasn't allowed near restrooms? It wasn't so hard, said Mrs. Warren. First of all, any time he went out, he should already have informed her, so that she or a babysitter could watch him. If the possibility of needing a change existed, they would know about it, and could appropriately interpret his usage of a bathroom. If he used it to change himself, he should naturally have a used diaper to show for it, and this could be checked when he arrived home. He was, however, warned that any trip to a public restroom would be carefully watched and, often, timed. Some of his babysitters might even be male and could follow him in. Any activity conspicuous for masturbation or using a toilet would be punished as such. As long as he hurried and was a good boy, he'd be okay. So he went off with his pink diaper bag to take his test. It lasted through lunch, and he found that by restricting fluids, he didn't have a problem needing a change. This was a relief for him. No one even noticed his bag, or his bulky bottom, or his waddle, or his rustling, probably because everyone was so preoccupied with the test. Doug came home from the test impressed with his academic performance, considering all the stress he'd been under during the preceding week. With the test finished Saturday night, though, Doug started thinking about the future. He was worried about going grocery shopping tomorrow, his first errand outside his apartment wearing diapers. He also started thinking more long-term, and he was already tired of wearing these huge diapers. It was a pain. In all of his fantasies, he'd never imagined he could miss the convenience of the toilet, but he was starting to. It took longer to change messy diapers, and cleaning himself was tedious and, often, gross. Fussing with tapes and getting the fit right took practice. It would be so much easier to pop into a bathroom and use a urinal. In addition, there was also the growing problem of his mounting sexual appetite. He hadn't come in several days, and that was just about a record for him. Plus, he wasn't excited about resuming his public life on Monday when he went back to work. Hiding these bulky diapers might be impossible, and would at the very least be a huge social burden he'd have to deal with constantly. All in all, he was beginning to feel far less obedient than he had over the past few days. He was starting to see that, just as he'd feared, he couldn't live this life constantly. It wasn't practical or desirable. If he was going to cope, he'd have to figure out some ways to cut corners, to express his independence in little, harmless ways, and to maintain a vestige of his former autonomy. He mulled this over in his head, before forming a plan for tomorrow. He needed groceries. He assumed he'd be followed, or something, but he wondered how Mrs. Warren would follow him if she didn't know he'd left. What if he left right after she visited tomorrow? She never returned right away. She'd never know. And if she didn't know, he could venture out without his diaper, and not risk embarrassment tomorrow at the store. It made him a little nervous to think about, but it had to work, right? If he was scared, he could always take along a diaper in the car, into which he might be able to change quickly if he somehow met Mrs. Warren on the way there or back. And he'd hurry, to cut down further the chance of being discovered. The risk, he calculated, had to be minuscule. And the symbolism, and implications for later, were enormous to him. If he could poke a little hole in her regime, there might be other opportunities later. His life might end up being manageable after all. Doug went to sleep Saturday night excited, with the first bit of hope about the future that he'd had in days. As he settled into bed, feeling the now familiar thick cushion between his legs, and hearing the omnipresent crinkling of his diaper, he could hardly wait until for what the next day would bring. If he'd known what would really happen, however, he wouldn't have wanted ever to wake up. Mrs. Warren visited Doug around noon on Sunday, which was great for Doug's plans. After she left, he watched the diaper van exit the apartment complex's parking lot, and as soon as it disappeared, he ran upstairs and took off his diaper. He was going to leave it at home, but on second thought, just to be safe, he folded it carefully and decided to take it with him, on the off chance he saw Mrs. Warren on the way to the grocery store. He wasn't going to take any chances. He pulled his jeans back up, and immediately noticed how strange not wearing a diaper felt after only a couple of days. It felt weirder, of course, because he didn't have any underwear to wear, so his normally insulated skin was in direct contact with his rough jeans. In addition, for the first time in 15 years, he had no pubic hair, so he felt the odd sensation of breezes drifting through his crotch periodically. But he had to hurry. He didn't want to be out of his diaper for more than 45 minutes this first time. It would be too horrible if she found out. Later, he might explore the limits of his freedom, but right now he wanted to play it very conservatively. So he took the spare diaper, grabbed his keys, and jumped into the car. He drove carefully to the grocery store, keeping an eye out for pastel-colored vans, but as he expected, didn't see any. He quickly made his way inside the store, grabbed a cart, and efficiently started collecting the items he needed. He was organized and fast, he wanted to take no chances. He breezed through several aisles before seeing the one thing that could make his heart skip a beat. Mrs. Warren was in the store. He saw her near the cash registers, but she didn't see him, he thought. She didn't have a cart, so it appeared that she must just be looking for something specific. Suddenly it hit him. She was looking for him. He didn't know how, but she'd found him. He peeked down an aisle and saw her crossing it at the other end. He knew what he had to try to do, guess where she was heading, and go the other way. He could still escape, get home, and get into a diaper before she caught him. It wasn't a sure bet, but it was possible. He could be quite savvy in these situations. But damn! How had she found him? And now he questioned why he had even taken this chance. His bottom tingled. He didn't want to cross this lady again. He was still a little sore from the first spanking, for God's sake. 45 minutes out of a diaper was hardly worth this risk, he belatedly realized. Thinking quickly, Doug reversed his direction and turned down an aisle, pushing his cart with urgency. He was halfway down the aisle, thinking he might actually make it past the registers and safely to his car, when Mrs. Warren suddenly appeared directly in front of him at the end of the aisle. How? Doug froze in panic. Seeing him, she turned and strode toward him. Doug began to feel queasy. What would happen now? He was in an extremely vulnerable situation. He'd snuck out of the apartment without telling her, and he wasn't wearing his diaper. He feared the worst, and Mrs. Warren wasn't one to disappoint. Well, Dougie, what a surprise it is to see you here, she said with more than a hint of sarcasm. I didn't know you were headed out. Maybe we've forgotten some of our rules. She paused, letting her eyes sweep over him in a quick, practiced assessment of his diaper status. Doug felt his body tense. He, correctly, surmised that she now knew that he was undiapered. He stared at her face, looking for any sign of this fact, but her expression didn't change. Well, Doug, I know it's early in your ICP, and there are a lot of rules to remember, so why don't we go easy on you here, she said, with just a little too much sweetness in her voice for Doug's taste. We'll just play the wet bet and leave it at that. Okay. If you win, no punishment for leaving home without telling me. But, she smiled at him knowingly. If you lose, you lose. Doug's mind swirled. The wet bet. He'd read about it, he thought. But what was it? She read his mind. I know you haven't yet played this little game, so I'll describe it for you. It's very simple. I make a bet with you that you're not wearing your diaper now. I know you're a good little boy, so I'm sure I'm wrong, but you just need to prove it to me. So I ask you to wet for me right now. You pee, and then we see who wins the bet. If you win, and you're wearing your diaper, then you only end up with a wet diaper that we can change very easily. If I win, and you don't have a diaper on, that fact will become very obvious very soon. In that case, her voice trailed off, indicating the undesirability of that outcome. But either way, I have to insist you take the bet. She went on, your only other option would be a particularly severe spanking right here in this aisle. Most of my boys don't like their pants pulled down in public, so I don't get to do that very often. They always take the bet. She sort of smirked at him. Well, what'll it be? You wanna take the bet? Now Doug was scared. She had him pinned against a wall, and she knew it. Wetting his pants in public versus a spanking in public. He'd had a spanking before, though, and decided that even public humiliation by wetting his pants be better than that. Anything would be better than a public spanking. He swallowed hard, as he realized he really had no choice. At least if he sucked it up and wet himself right now, he'd avoid any other punishment. It would be humiliating, but it would be otherwise painless, and over very quickly. Then he could go right home and change. He stared at the floor and nodded. She smiled cruelly, though he didn't see it. That's a good boy. Now, here's how we'll do it. I'll turn around, and you can start peeing. Then you'll tell me when you're done, and we'll try to figure out who won. If your pants are dry, I'll need to see your diaper, of course, to make sure you didn't cheat. That would earn you a spanking, too. She smiled that fake smile again as she said, of course, I'm sure you wouldn't cheat. He nodded nervously. Okay, she said, turning away to pretend to look at some spaghetti. Fire when ready. Doug glanced nervously down the aisle both ways. Not seeing anyone, he tried to relax and empty his bladder. He felt a trickle come out, and then more, so he said, "Okay." She said, "Okay, keep going. 10 seconds should be enough." Doug grimaced. He felt his urine rush out now. He really had needed to go. That was unfortunate. He looked down and watched in horror as his crotch darkened quickly, and then he shuddered as he felt hot pee flowing down his legs, soaking his jeans. The insides of his pants legs turned dark blue, and he felt his socks get warm and wet before he saw his tennis shoes flood and then overflow. It would be unmistakable to anyone who saw him what had just happened. By the time he figured 10 seconds was up, he was standing in soaking wet jeans, in a small puddle on the floor. In a weak voice, he said, "I'm done, Mommy." Maybe she wouldn't make fun of him if he buttered her up. He just wanted to go home and change his pants. They were already turning cold and uncomfortable. But when Mrs. Warren turned and saw Doug in wet pants, her expression changed to one of anger, something he'd not seen since that first morning last week. He watched her with growing apprehension as she opened her large purse and pulled out what he recognized as one of his diapers. How did she know to bring one, he thought idly. And what was it for? "Here," she snapped. "You'll need this." She put the diaper in one of his hands and grabbed the other. She yanked on his arm, dragging him with her in the direction of the registers. He tried to follow, uncertain of what was happening, but acutely aware now of his wet, heavy pants. They were already starting to cool and feel uncomfortable. He hoped they were headed outside to the car, but his hope sank as she led him up to the nearest register. Doug withered with embarrassment as moms and children turned and one by one saw him, wearing wet pants and holding a large diaper. "Could you tell me where the little boy's room is?" Mrs. Warren inquired of the young lady at the register. She looked a little younger than he, and had surprisingly large breasts. Doug couldn't help staring at her blonde hair and beautiful face. Mrs. Warren was not similarly mesmerized. "I've got one who needs his pants changed." The checkout girl's eyes widened, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, he sure does. He seems a little big to be having accidents." Mrs. Warren snorted with derision. "Well, he's apparently not as big as he seems, is he?" The girl took a moment to study Doug's stained jeans. "No, I guess not." "Well, that's what the diaper's for, right?" "Too bad for him he wasn't in one earlier," she giggled, seeing Mrs. Warren's obvious anger at Doug. Noting the determination on her face as well, she added, "I bet he'll wear one from now on. But anyway, the restrooms are in the back corner of the store. You can change him there." Doug could have died. He felt his face burn with embarrassment. Could this day get any worse? "Thank you," he heard Mrs. Warren say. "And I'm afraid this little boy also left a puddle in aisle number 3. If you give me a minute to get him dressed a little more appropriately, I can have him back out to clean it up." The girl nodded, staring hard at Doug's pants, clearly trying not to laugh. "That's fine, but you probably need to see the manager first. She likes to know about things like this, and she can get him a mop or something. Oh, by the way, if you need more diapers for him, we are having a sale on a 10s down in aisle 7. Thanks, but we're very well stocked already. Trust me, we have to be. Now, where is your manager?" The girl pointed at the other front corner of the store, so Mrs. Warren led Doug across the entire front of the store. They passed dozens of people in line to check out, and most of them turned and saw him. Doug started to feel lightheaded. This was horrible. The manager was on the phone in the customer service area, so they had to wait a moment before talking to her. Mrs. Warren still had an iron grip on Doug's wrist, and Doug instinctively struggled a little to get her to loosen her grip. At this Mrs. Warren wheeled around with fire in her eyes and swatted his bottom. Since it was damp and undiapered, this stung quite a bit, not to mention the added embarrassment it caused him. He was being treated like a 2-year-old, and the worst thing was, with his wet pants and stinging bottom, he felt just like one, too. "Don't you mess with me, young man, Mrs. Warren said loudly, so that she caught the attention of anyone in nearby lines who wasn't already staring. "You've already done enough." "Evidently so," said the manager, a stout stern-looking woman who had finished her phone conversation and was now studying Doug's pants with a disapproving gaze. "Looks like you're a little late with the diaper, young man." "Mrs. Warren turned her attention to her, but kept a firm grip on Doug's aching wrist. "Yes, I was going to ask you if I could use your restroom to change his pants anyway. Afterward, I was hoping that he could clean up the little puddle he left in aisle number 3. "Of course," the manager said. "I'll leave a bucket and mop in the back hallway for when he's a little more properly attired," she said, smiling at the diaper in Doug's hand. She pointed them to the rear of the store, and Doug was now dragged at what felt like breakneck speed back past all the registers with lines of people whispering, down a side aisle, and to the back corner of the store. They turned in a short hallway and found a door marked "Restroom, Men/Women." "Mrs. Warren tried the door, but it was locked. She knocked, and a female voice inside said, "Just a second." So they waited. Doug nervously held his diaper and tried to ignore the now stone-cold wetness of his pants and the pain in his wrist. "Mrs. Warren was silent, staring away from him. Doug wanted to know what would happen in that little room, but he didn't dare bother her. He assumed they would change his diaper and then come out and clean up the mess. He wasn't looking forward to it. He spent his time telling himself how dumb he'd been, how he'd never sneak out or not wear his diaper again. Finally, the door opened and a woman came out. She caught sight of Doug with wet pants and a diaper in his hand, and gasped. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't realize I was taking so long." "Mrs. Warren spoke up right away. Don't blame yourself. This happened out there in the store because someone wasn't wearing his diaper like a good boy. I just need the bathroom so I can remedy the situation." Doug was finally so embarrassed that he totally tuned out what was happening. He pretended he was somewhere else, and ignored this humiliating experience. "Oh," said the woman, with a knowing look at Mrs. Warren. "Do you think he's learned his lesson yet?" "I don't know, Mrs. Warren replied, "but I'll make sure, just as soon as I can get his pants down in there and turn him over my knee." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Well, good luck. Don't go easy on that wet bottom, or he'll never learn." "Don't worry, Mrs. Warren assured her. "He won't forget this." The woman left, and Mrs. Warren pulled a distracted Doug into the small bathroom. She whipped him around and closed and locked the door, then let go of him. While Doug rubbed his wrist, Mrs. Warren sat down on the closed toilet seat. Doug stood quietly and watched as Mrs. Warren pulled out of her large black purse what looked like a changing pad. He had to admit to himself that this woman was always prepared. She must have known that she'd catch him, and had come with everything she'd need to put a diaper on him, he thought. And if he was going to have to lay down on this bathroom's floor to be changed, he was actually pleased at the prospect of using a changing pad. But she didn't spread it out on the floor. He grew sort of confused as he watched her smooth it out on her lap. He'd never heard of being changed on someone's lap, but it was a small bathroom, and he was new to this. When the pad seemed well smoothed out, Mrs. Warren addressed him sharply. "All right, little boy. Get those pants down around your ankles." Doug said, "Yes, Mommy," trying to stay on her good side. She didn't seem to be getting any less angry, which worried him a bit. He obeyed quickly, telling himself this was obviously a necessary step before he could be diapered. "Come face me," she said shortly. He shuffled over to her. How was this going to work? Hand me the diaper now, Doug. So he held it out to her with his left hand. She'll clearly need that, he thought. The other hand, she said, annoyed. That's odd, he thought, as he obediently switched the diaper to his right hand and held it out to her. Why should that make a difference? He found out very quickly. Mrs. Warren reached out with her left hand and took the diaper from his right, as she simultaneously reached across her body with her other hand to grasp his outstretched wrist. In a smooth, strong, and practiced motion, she yanked on his right arm, turning him, throwing him off balance, and directing his fall across her lap perfectly. In the space of 2 seconds, Doug was surprised to find himself suddenly staring at the bathroom floor. He saw Mrs. Warren set the diaper aside, and it dawned on him that she had something else entirely on her mind. It became clearer why she wanted the changing pad on her lap. But this shouldn't be happening, he thought. They'd had a deal. Hey, he yelled in frustration. That's not fair. I took the bet. And you lost, little boy. So you get a spanking. Don't you remember your rules? By taking the bet, you simply prevented this from happening out there in the aisle where you wet your pants. Would you rather we do this out in the store where everyone can see what a bad baby boy you've been? Pause. Smack. Oops. He'd thought it was a rhetorical question. No. Smack. No, what? No, Mommy. I'm sorry. That's better. Now let's have a little discussion about your behavior today. Why don't you start by explaining to me what you've done wrong since the last time I saw you? He hated her. She was going to draw this out and make it even more humiliating than it already was. But he wasn't really in a position to argue. So he told the floor in front of him. I took off my diaper, Mommy. Yes, and what else? I went out without telling you. That's right. And does that make you a good little boy or a bad little boy? Bad. Smack. I'm a bad little boy, Mommy. That's true. And what do little boys like you need when they are bad? They need a spanking, Mommy. So what do you need right now, Doug? I need a spanking, Mommy. He was embarrassed and angry. Never in his wildest dreams did he ever think he'd hear himself say something like that. That's also true. And how many spankings do you think you need? Doug's blood ran cold. What? She ought to be kidding, but so far, Mrs. Warren hadn't kidded around very much. I think I'd like one spanking, Mommy, Doug said hopefully. Smack. Smack. Guess not, he thought. Damn. I need 2 spankings, Mommy, he said, aware that he'd begun to whimper a little. This was worse than he could have imagined. If that spanking last week was 1, what must 2 be like? That's right, Doug. You need 2 spankings because you broke 2 different rules today. For my convenience, I'm just going to combine them into one long spanking, though. Now, just as a reminder, after our spanking, do we get to rub our bottom with our hands? No, Mommy. Shit. He'd forgotten about that. Why not? Mrs. Warren asked with a little sadistic glee. So it will hurt more, Doug answered obediently. This was so horrible. And worse, his appreciation grew for the fact that he could never, ever tell anyone what he'd been through. It was too embarrassing almost to think about. No one would believe him. How would he get his real life back? That's a good boy. I know you can't hold on to chair legs here, so just keep your hands down and out of the way. Any questions? Yeah, he thought. What did I ever do to deserve this? To her, he managed a weak, no, Mommy. And his bottom tingled with expectation as he remembered vividly the pain from last week. He cursed himself again for having tried such an unnecessary prank. Never again, he promised himself as the spanking began. Smack. 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 The pain was unbearable right from the beginning, and the knowledge that it would not soon stop and the humiliation and stress he'd already endured caused Doug to start crying almost immediately. Unfortunately, Mrs. Warren actually seemed annoyed by this, and she redoubled her efforts to paddle his bottom. He sobbed, and she spanked mercilessly, until they were both out of breath. Doug was grateful when she stopped, though it turned out it was only to remove a small, flat, hairbrush from her purse. This, he realized, would be the second spanking. His bottom was sort of numb from the first one, but he was startled to realize how much more painful it was than her bare hands. He cried all the way through. When it had lasted longer than Doug thought possible, Mrs. Warren stopped and stood him up. Tears streaming down his face, Doug's hands immediately and instinctively made their way to his red, hot bottom. He rubbed it as he cried, trying to overwhelm the searing pain that still raged through his rear end. Mrs. Warren reached over, grabbed one of his arms, now limp as spaghetti from his ordeal, swung him around and swatted him several times again. No touching, little boy, she fumed. Do it again and we can start over from the beginning. Doug fought through his tears to find the energy to say, yes, Mommy, and to obey. He managed to hold his arms stiffly down at his sides. All he could think about was how much his bottom hurt, how miserable he was, and how much he hated Mrs. Warren. He was oblivious to Mrs. Warren as she now spread out the changing pad on the floor and laid his diaper out on top of it. She gently guided him down to it, positioned his abused bottom over the back of the diaper and had him lie down. He allowed her to lift his legs, rub some lotion on his hot skin, and sprinkle him with a generous amount of powder before lowering his legs, pulling the diaper through, and taping him up tightly. He was beginning to stop crying as she stood him up. He had no energy to resist her as she did something intended to embarrass him even further. Once they left this room, she tucked his shirt deep inside his diaper, and pulled the diaper's waist up as high as it would go. When she pulled his still wet pants back up and buckled them, about 2 inches of diaper were clearly visible above his jeans. Doug didn't even notice. Mrs. Warren folded up her changing pad and put it away, stowed the hairbrush, then brushed off her strong hands. That had been exhilarating and, as always, excellent exercise. But she wasn't done with Doug today. Doug was close to getting his sniffles under control as Mrs. Warren unlocked and opened the door. Several employees who had apparently been hovering just outside, entertained by the sound of Doug's spanking, dispersed rapidly. Doug stepped out into the service hallway and was acutely aware of how his diaper insulated his still hot bottom, so that the heat amplified the continued pain he felt. His legs, on the other hand, were ice cold and wet from his soaked jeans. He felt completely miserable. But he had another embarrassing ordeal to withstand, if he didn't want another spanking, so Doug dutifully took the mop and bucket he saw waiting in the hall, and slowly wheeled them toward aisle number 3, where a small, slippery when wet sign had been placed near the puddle he'd made not half an hour ago. People he passed whispered and stared, but Doug almost didn't care now. He tried to shut out the outside world, though his inside world wasn't any more comforting. Mrs. Warren followed at a short distance, keeping a watchful eye on her charge, but he was behaving well. It was then that she knew that while he obviously had an enjoyable little rebellious streak in him, he also would probably end up being one of her best clients. He had a little fight in him, to make it fun, but he also had some common sense, too, and knew when to quit. Doug mopped quietly. The first time he looked down, he caught sight of the diaper protruding so blatantly from his pants, and it didn't take much to realize that it had been done on purpose. He glanced at Mrs. Warren, who had observed his discovery, and she smiled at him slightly. He took a deep breath and kept mopping. There was simply nothing he could do about it. His bottom hurt more than enough already. When he'd finished and returned the mop and bucket to the back hallway, Mrs. Warren guided him back to the manager's office. On the way she told him what she wanted him to say. Doug started politely, when the manager came over with an amused smile on her face. I just wanted to apologize for wetting myself here in your store, and for making that puddle over there. I, cleaned it all up. I, just wanted to say I'm sorry. That's good, the manager observed. I heard quite a racket back there in that bathroom where you two were. Do you think you learned a lesson? Doug coughed with embarrassment, and looked toward Mrs. Warren, who returned his glance with a questioning look. Yes, he said, finding it hard to meet her eyes. I, promise it will never happen again. He was sure of this. And how can I be sure of that? The manager inquired. Well, said Doug, I'm wearing a diaper now. Oh, yes, I see, she replied, pretending to notice for the first time. Not quite ready for big boy pants, are we? She said, as if to a 3-year-old. This was so degrading, being treated like this. But he had no choice but to humor these women. But he still couldn't look her in the eye, mumbling, no, I guess not. He noticed Mrs. Warren giving him a meaningful glance. Oh, and I wanted to ask you if I might be allowed to finish grocery shopping now, he remembered to ask. I guess that would be all right, the manager said, looking to Mrs. Warren, who was nodding at her, for her answer, the way strangers will often do with a child and his parent. As long as your mommy thinks you've learned a lesson, and are wearing a diaper like a good little boy. Yes, Doug murmured, his bottom and face burning from the spanking and the embarrassment. And may I please have permission to shop here in the future? The manager said thoughtfully. Yes, you may, if you come wearing a diaper which is at all times visible, such as you're wearing now, so that my employees and I can tell the big boys from the little ones like you. She seemed to decide something. Also, I'd like for you to check in here when you first get here so that I can tell an employee to keep an eye on you. Any puddles, misbehavior, or even so much as a wet spot on your jeans will be dealt with very harshly, young man. My children will tell you that I can warm a fanny with the best of them. She smiled warmly at Mrs. Warren, who smiled back appreciatively. And one more thing. I want you to bring a spare diaper with you, in case there is a leakage problem. I can find one of my staff to change you, or I can certainly do it myself. Okay. Doug nodded. Yes, Thank you. That's a good boy, the manager said, and winked at Mrs. Warren, who was deeply impressed. She'd actually never been to this store or met this woman before, but this stranger seemed to have a natural understanding for what was going on. Mrs. Warren began to think more of her boys would shop here in the future. What a pleasant surprise. Doug resumed shopping grimly. The rest of the trip was excruciating, and dreadfully slow, so he had time to consider what had just happened. He'd just set himself up for weekly humiliation and public embarrassment, and had thanked the lady for it. Abdl Story Part 8. Doug packed his diaper bag Sunday night for his return to work without objection. His bottom and ego still hurt from the day's events, and he was in no mood to put up a fuss. Still, he was more than a little uneasy about the following day, when he would head to work while wearing his diaper and carrying his pink diaper bag. He was worried about people at the lab finding out, since the job and the graduate program to which he expected it to lead seemed to be all he was living for now that the rest of his normal life had been taken away. So while he obediently placed 3 fresh diapers, powder, baby wipes, and lotion into his bag, his mind was racing for ways to make himself less conspicuous. Some ideas were obvious. He'd decided that, starting tomorrow, he'd go in earlier and leave later. That way he could get to and from his lab unseen and wouldn't have to answer questions about his bulging, waddling, rustling, or his babyish bag. Appearing to work harder wouldn't hurt his admission prospects, either. In some ways he was very lucky to have the job he had, working alone, being able to wear what he wanted and essentially to decide what hours he'd work. He had some lab meetings to attend each week, but not many. These features were excellent, since he now wanted to avoid other people as much as possible and needed to wear something practical. He had bulky pants and a long sweatshirt that might work. Good thing winter's coming, he thought. It would be way harder to wear the kind of bulky clothing that was necessary if it were hot. It was the prospect of diaper changes that really made him anxious. His floor in the lab building had one unisex bathroom in one of the more public areas. It wasn't uncommon to see lots of people on his way there or back, or for there to be a line. He couldn't carry the diaper bag, or, even worse, a diaper and some wipes, into the bathroom. It hadn't been until after Mrs. Warren left Sunday night that Doug struck on the idea of plastic grocery bags in which to carry clean diaper down and dirty diapers back. If it was around lunchtime when he went, he could even say he was just stopping off on the way to lunch. He felt much better after he pre-bagged his diaper changes for tomorrow. With any luck, he might be able to get away with this without anyone finding out. Monday morning Doug woke up, dry as usual, and tried to get ready as normally would any other morning, except that this morning he had to wet himself intentionally before his shower, and re-diaper himself afterward. He left his apartment early, and indeed got to his lab early as well, before anyone else had arrived. Relieved, he tucked his telltale bag safely into an unused lab cupboard and got to work. He was very conscious of how often he wet himself, as leaks might be horribly embarrassing, and so he checked his diaper several times before deciding at 10:30 a.m. that he'd better try to change himself. So he put his clandestine operation into action and was thrilled when it seemed to go off without a hitch. No one really seemed to notice. From there the rest of the day was easier. He had to change himself once more, in mid-afternoon, and he waited until the halls were relatively deserted before waddling home. All in all, the day had been much simpler than he could have hoped for. And the next several days went well also, in that he seemed to manage to keep his forced infantilization a secret from his co-workers. Mrs. Warren dropped by every day or so, to say hi. Wednesday night she commented that she'd been told that Doug was being a good boy at work, and that she was glad to hear it. Doug's heart stopped. Mrs. Warren had an informant at work. Someone in his last bastion of normality knew about him. He didn't say anything to Mrs. Warren. Sitting down was only now becoming painless, but his mind once again raced, as he tried to pinpoint who his informant could possibly be. He should have known he'd be spied upon. But now he worried that the informants might tell others. Everyone might already know by now. But he couldn't ask, because that would give it away. He was forced to watch everyone on Thursday, looking for clues that they might be onto him. But if anyone knew, they were quiet about it. No one appeared to watch him or react any differently than in the past. Thursday night, as he was sneaking home after he'd thought everyone had left, he turned a corner and ran right into his lab director, Dr. Stillman, a tall, strikingly beautiful woman in her late 30s, with long brown hair and deep brown eyes. She was also, not coincidentally, the admissions director for the doctoral program Doug hoped to enter next fall. "Ah, Doug, isn't it?" she asked crisply as she sized him up in front of her. Doug tried to hide his bag behind his legs. "Keeping late hours, are we?" "Well, that can't hurt. It's nice to see someone working so hard for a change." At this, she sort of chuckled to herself, and kept walking. Doug stood in the hall after she'd left and tried to figure out what she'd meant by that. It had seemed like a compliment, and yet she'd laughed. She always intimidated Doug, to some degree because he found her extremely attractive. Now, though, in his paranoid mood, he found himself wondering if his boss might actually be the informant, working hard for a change, she'd said. Maybe this had meant something else from what he'd thought. This would worry Doug for a long time, and perhaps never be satisfactorily settled for him, since she never made any other similar comments and he knew he couldn't exactly ask her directly. Other than this incident, the rest of the week was uneventful, and Doug finished his second week of diaperhood smoothly. He was as obedient as he could be, and tried to wet and soil his diaper conscientiously. He settled into a predictable pattern of changing himself in the late morning and mid-afternoon, and he found that as long as he remembered to do that, he didn't need to think about when exactly he wet himself. That seemed convenient to Doug, though he would discover later that it was yet another piece in the puzzle of his undoing. On Sunday, Doug reluctantly and self-consciously waddled into the grocery store, scene of last week's humiliation, spare diaper in hand. The diaper he wore was necessarily pulled up outside his shirt for the world to see. He wished desperately that he didn't have to do this, but he knew he did. He tried to stare straight ahead and to ignore the stares of shoppers, and fervently hoped that no one he knew saw him like this. He walked over to the manager's office and knocked on the door. "Well, look who's back," the manager observed when she saw Doug. "And you remembered how I want you to dress as well, that's a good start. What's your name, young man?" "Doug," he replied, not wanting to get any more detailed than that. Luckily, it seemed as though that's all she wanted. "Well, I'm Mrs. Johnson, Doug," she said. "As you recall, I told you I'd have one of my employees look after you while you're here. Let's see who's available." She yelled over to the pretty young cashier who had laughed at Doug the previous week. "Emily, have you had your break?" The young girl nodded. "Just came off it. Sandy has my register." Emily walked over, obviously staring at Doug's visible diaper as she approached. "Good, Mrs. Johnson said. This is Doug. Perhaps you remember him from last Sunday, he wet his pants in aisle 3. Of course I remember, she said, giggling. Doug blushed. It had to be this girl. Well, this week he's more suitably dressed, as you can see. But I'd still like for you to babysit him while he shops. Follow him and supervise his behavior. If there is any misbehavior at all, you are to tell me immediately, and you or I will take care of it. What do you mean? Emily asked Mrs. Johnson, looking at Doug with amusement. I mean that if he needs it, one of us will give him a spanking back in the stockroom. He got one last week, and it seemed to work well. Doug's head pounded with embarrassment. Doug saw that Emily was having trouble controlling her laughter. Mrs. Johnson, however, ignored her. Now, Doug, can you tell when you've wet or messed in your diaper? She asked. Doug frowned. Of course he could, but why did she have to bring that up now, other than to embarrass him? But he had to answer. Ah, yes, he answered with a very shy glance toward Emily. Good. I expect you to tell Emily if it happens so she can change you. Emily, you can use the stockroom for that as well, just ask me for the key. And check his diaper several times each visit while he shops, just to make sure. We don't want a scene like last week because of overflow. If he's wet or dirty and didn't tell you first, bring him back here. He'll need a spanking for that, too, if we think it was intentional. She turned away from them. That's all. You two come back here when you're done shopping. Be good, she added, presumably for Doug's benefit. They turned away and headed toward the rows of empty carts. Did you really get a spanking last week? Emily asked him immediately. Doug hung his head. Yes, he said quietly, hoping she would drop the subject. He picked a cart and they headed for the produce section. How come? Doug stopped and looked at her. She was half smiling, obviously amused at the idea of his being spanked like a bad little boy. Her blue eyes sparkled, and Doug found himself staring into them for a moment, briefly bewitched by her young beauty. Then he shook himself. She was probably 18 or 19 at the most, several years younger than he. He thought that was not appropriate. And besides that, she knew he was wearing a diaper. Even if she were of a proper age for him, he wouldn't have stood a chance with that humiliation. I'd rather not talk about it, he said, finally, and turned to look through a bin of apples. but she was insistent. No, really. Why? When Doug didn't speak, she said, "You wouldn't want me to give my manager a bad report, would you?" Doug turned back to her, fear suddenly in his eyes. "You wouldn't do that, would you?" "Maybe, maybe not," she said coyly, her eyes twinkling. "I'm the babysitter. You'd better behave." Just what he needed, Doug thought. A teenager on a power trip. "Look," he said. "It's really embarrassing." Perhaps he could play on her sympathy. And there was silence for a moment. So she does have a heart, Doug thought. Thank goodness. But then, was it because you wet your pants? She asked it simply, apparently not to tease him, and without malice. She just didn't seem to recognize his discomfort. She only seemed very curious and slightly amused. The question was, why was she so curious? She ought to be grossed out. Could she actually be turned on by this? He'd always dreamed of meeting a female who could share and participate in his diaper wearing. "'Cause my little brother, Joey, got spanked every time he wet his pants," she went on. "Oh, really?" Doug replied with disappointment, now irritated that he should be thought of in the same vein as her stupid little pants-wetting brother. Well, now he knew how she thought of him. He should have known, that would teach him to get his hopes up. He moved on, collecting his groceries. "Yeah, he's 12 now, and it doesn't happen anymore," Emily told him. "But he used to do it a lot, and Mom would spank him for it. Probably couldn't help it, I guess." She followed him in silence for a couple of steps. "So do you still wet your pants a lot?" she asked. "No," Doug answered with more annoyance. As pretty as she was turning out to be a pest. If she wasn't interested in him, then she was just being cruel, he decided. "But you did last week, and that's why your mom spanked you, right?" Once more Doug stopped to glare at her. "Look, she's not my mom, okay? Please just drop it." "She's not?" Emily asked, wrinkling her brow. "Who is she then?" "Oh, crap," he thought. "I can't go there. We can't get into this." He shook his head. "It's really complicated." They were now passing the back corner of the store and the hallway with the bathroom where Doug had been soundly spanked the week before. This distracted Emily from her interrogation, and she remembered one of her duties. "We should check your diaper," she chirped happily, tugging at Doug's sleeve. Reluctantly he left his half-full cart and followed her into the hallway, where they couldn't be seen by other shoppers. "Okay, pull down your pants," Emily said, obviously trying to sound mature. However, her enthusiasm and amusement shone through her facade of professionalism. "Look, you really don't need to do this. I know for a fact that it's dry," Doug offered hopefully. She put her hands on her hips indignantly. "I'm the babysitter, not you. You're just the baby. And I want you to pull down your pants so I can see your diaper." Doug still hesitated. She was so young to be ordering him around. "Do it now," she said sharply. Doug knew that in this situation, as in many others, he didn't have much choice. He didn't know whether or not she'd really make good on the threat to spank him, but he didn't want to find out. So he unbuckled and unzipped his jeans and self-consciously lowered them to the floor. "Oh, that's a good boy," Emily said, in a babyish tone. She laughed at her own efforts at humor. Doug blushed again, not finding it quite as funny as she apparently did. Emily leaned over and inspected the little indicator stripe, which indeed verified Doug's assertion of dryness. Despite his embarrassment, Doug felt an erection start to build inside his diaper. It had been a difficult 2 weeks since he had come, and it didn't take much to get him hard. For the first time Doug was thankful for the extreme thickness of his diaper, which probably prevented her from noticing. Suddenly she surprised him by reaching out and grabbing the rear of his diaper, squeezing and massaging it gently. She then did the same to the front. Doug was so shocked he didn't know what to do. What if she felt his erection? Just making sure, she explained to him as she straightened up again. But she said it with a smile that told Doug for the first time that maybe she was actually interested as much in what was inside his diaper as in its state of wetness. So what was she making sure of? Whether he was wet, or whether he was hard? He wondered. Or had he just imagined that little supposed flirtation? To Doug's frustration, since he wanted some clarity, Emily didn't let on one way or another. Okay, that's good. You can pull Em up. We'll check again later. She's apparently a very professional tease, he thought, reassessing his babysitter. If she really liked him and had just made a little move on him, she wasn't letting on to it now. But why would she tease him? He argued to himself as they returned to shopping. Could she possibly know about his ICP's prohibition of sex, and was she therefore being purposefully cruel? No, he thought, that's impossible. His heart quickened. I think she really likes me, he thought excitedly. And she's actually turned on by my diapers. Oh my God, he thought, unable to comprehend the ramifications of actually having found someone who was turned on by infantilism in general, and his infantilism in specific. He'd dreamed his whole life. His musing was cut short as Emily was back on the attack. So if you don't wet a lot, then why do you have to wear diapers? Doug didn't answer. He couldn't think of anything other than the truth that would be believable. Emily didn't seem to mind his silence. She kept on jabbering. My brother never had to wear diapers for wetting his pants. Well, I mean, after he was about 4. He kept right on wetting his pants in his bed, and Mom started spanking him for it. She said he was old enough to know better. And Joey would cry, but then he'd keep on wetting. Maybe he should have been put back in diapers, like you. She trailed off, apparently lost in thought. And then? Did it hurt? Doug was lost. He had been picking out some laundry detergent. Did what hurt? Your spanking. Did it hurt? Yes, Doug admitted quietly. His inhibitions had dropped slightly since he'd determined that she really did like him. In a relationship as potentially important as this one might be, he could maybe afford to open up a little. I bet it did, Emily said enthusiastically. Did you cry? Whoops. Too far, a little voice in Doug's head told him. He thought he could possibly talk about some of this, was dying to get some of it off his chest, and was thrilled someone like Emily existed. But he was deeply embarrassed about some aspects of it, and this was one of them. Emily, I'm kind of upset about the whole thing, okay? Can we please not talk about this stuff anymore? Emily nodded, and was silent as they made their way toward the dairy products. Then she couldn't resist asking just one more question. Do you have a girlfriend? Doug stopped and stared at her. So much for subtlety, maturity, and professionalism. No, he said simply. Oh, she replied. I'm in college. Are you in college? Not anymore, he told her. Phew, he thought. At least she isn't a minor. He finished shopping. When Doug was just about ready to check out, Emily said, time for another check. He immediately tensed up. Here we go again, he thought. I was so close to getting out of here. They walked back to the rear hallway, Doug's anxiety and erection simultaneously rising. What would happen this time? Could it, lead to anything? He found himself both hoping that something sexual would happen and scared that it might. He'd always dreamed of involving his diapers in a sexual relationship, and this girl was so beautiful. It was better than he could have hoped for. But then there was the omniscient, omnipotent Mrs. Warren, who had expressly prohibited any sexual activity. Emily, however, was the boss here. If anything happened, it wasn't his fault, right? He was torn and confused as she again asked him to pull down his pants. Now he was also scared of being discovered, his erection felt huge. He wondered if even his thick diaper could insulate it from her touch. maybe she wouldn't notice. Doug held his breath tensely as Emily, smiling, reached out and caressed his diaper, first in the back, and then, more extensively, in the front. She got a funny look on her face, as if she was considering something. Doug thought he heard her laugh quietly. He was about to say something, anything, to ease the tension, when she abruptly stopped, stood, and pronounced him dry. Doug let out his breath. Emily had him pull up his pants, and they went back up front, where Doug paid for his groceries. Then they stopped by Mrs. Johnson's office. "And were you a good boy today, Doug?" she asked him, though she clearly meant the question for Emily. Doug was pointedly ignored, and he felt like he was 3 years old, which he noted was becoming a common occurrence. Emily nodded. "Yes, He did as he was told. I checked him twice, and he was dry and clean both times. Good for him." "Okay, Doug, we'll see you back next week." "Same deal." "Thanks, Emily, you can get back to your register," she added before turning away. "No problem." "No problem at all." "Gee, bye, Doug," Emily said. She flashed him a meaningful smile. "I'll see you next week." At this, she laughed hysterically and walked away. "Gee, bye, Emily," Doug said to her back, and sighed as she walked away. She definitely turned him on, even if she was criminally nosy. The boys at her school must drool over her, he thought. He took his groceries to his car, and spent the rest of the day trying to decide how her obvious fondling of him had been meant. Her parting comment, too, was an obvious reference to the activities she seemed to be planning for next week. He was already worried about it, but couldn't help but be excited as well. He had a lot to think about this week. Who knew what his next shopping trip would bring? Abdl Story Part 9. Week 3 brought more of the same to Doug, who had definitely given up trying to fight his ICP for the time being. It was annoying as hell to deal with the diapers, but his life hadn't ended yet, either. No one seemed to know yet, outside of Mrs. Warren, the grocery store women, and the mystery informant at work. His role was pretty easy, actually, just use his diapers mindlessly and change them several times a day. And it wasn't that inconvenient, except for the messy diapers. Otherwise, it was nice not to have to go all the way to the toilet to relieve himself. Now, if he felt ever the slightest twinge in his bladder, he just relaxed a little, and it went away. He was determined to enjoy the few perks to this setup. He had his BMs pretty well regulated to the evenings when he was in the privacy of his apartment, and though he hated having to sit in them first, he usually showered immediately after that, so all in all cleanup wasn't that difficult either. But he disliked the bulk of his diapers, and having to walk funny, though he noticed this less and less. One thing he was definitely more aware of was always having to think about his diapers in public. Were they visible? Could people tell? When other people were around, he always had to think about whether he could move safely without being heard. He learned to carry his keys around and jingle them loudly if it was quiet enough that someone might hear his plastic crinkling. He was paranoid, but so far he still didn't have any evidence that people suspected. The shaving was becoming old hat as well. At first it had been very itchy, now it was better. He shaved his groin daily and his bottom every other day, since it was more difficult. While it was humiliating to have to do it, he ended up being happy he'd done it every time he had a messy diaper. He did laundry once a week, and only after Mrs. Warren had looked through his clothes and sheets. He received several more huge packages of disposable diapers each week, and slowly worked his way through them, turning in smelly trash bags full of old ones. He had started paying for his diapers after the first week, which sort of made him mad. Sure, it was a reasonable price for what he got, but he didn't want what he got. Still, everything that third week went smoothly, and everything seemed to be getting easier and slightly more tolerable. Except it had now been 3 weeks since he'd had an orgasm. an all-time record since his early teens. As the days had dragged on, he'd thought about it more and more, until by now almost every waking moment, and many of his dreams, too, were spent thinking about sex. In the past, dreams and fantasies had focused on two different themes: normal, heterosexual intercourse and his secret diaper fantasies, which often involved, ironically, being forced into diapers by an older woman. Now, presumably because of his present situation, these two separate topics seemed hopelessly muddled in his mind. If he had regular sex with a woman, she first had to take his diapers off. He never fantasized about being forced into anything anymore, but Mrs. Warren inexplicably showed up in several of his sex dreams. He tried to focus all of this energy productively, which for Doug meant trying to figure out a way to sneak in some masturbation, unknown to Mrs. Warren. He would have thought about actual sex with somebody, but the question was, with whom? He didn't really like the idea of anonymous sex, and who would want to get into a relationship with somebody still in diapers? Emily inevitably kept creeping into his mind, but he shook the thought away. He didn't want to think about what kind of punishment that might lead to. Masturbation was simply much safer and easier logistically. Even so, he was extremely paranoid that Mrs. Warren would find out somehow, and with good reason, so his scheme had to be brilliant. He knew she had an informant at work, so he couldn't just do it in the bathroom there, where he'd either have to flush the evidence, suspicious to an informed observer, because why would a diapered boy need to flush, or throw it away somewhere, and Doug felt sure that Mrs. Warren would find any evidence he left. Doug's first instinct, of course, was to whack off into his diaper, since he always found that most satisfying. But since his diapers were inspected specifically for this, Doug had to force himself to forego this pleasure. There was that chemical thing in the drains, and laundry was, of course, checked beforehand, which ruled out a lot of options at home. He decided he had to think of some way to smuggle home some paper products, hide them, use them, and then think of a foolproof disposal method. It was during this third week that he finally figured it out. He thought it through, over and over, and carefully considered every angle, but couldn't find a flaw. On Friday, then, after his afternoon change at work, Doug wadded up 2 small balls of toilet paper and stuffed them in the toes of his shoes, which made them uncomfortable, but not too bad. At least they still fit. It was perfect. No one, not even Mrs. Warren, would think of looking there, and if she did, he could simply say that the paper was there for comfort purposes, because his shoes were too big. It was nearly plausible as an emergency plan, but he was sure he would not need to use it. After he wore home the toilet paper, he found the other tools necessary for his plan: a half-full cereal box, and an empty Coke can. He would store the toilet paper in the bottom of the cereal box until he needed it, then stuff it inside the empty Coke can for disposal. It was brilliant. Now he was finally ready. And it was wonderful. It, not surprisingly, didn't take long, and he had a lot of difficulty keeping himself quiet, just in case. 3 weeks of near-constant excitement were released in a cataclysmic but all too brief orgasm, the evidence of which he was careful to contain entirely within the toilet paper and cram into the soda can. He peered inside and was thrilled when he couldn't see the contents of the can at all. It couldn't have been more perfect. He put the can in the trash amid leftover spaghetti with sauce, just to make examination of the can that much less convenient. And that night he slept very well indeed. The weekend went well, too. Sunday, when he returned with trepidation to the grocery store, he was both relieved and disappointed to learn that Emily was home, apparently sick, so she couldn't babysit him today. Instead, Doug was followed around by a homely, quiet girl who gave him weird looks but didn't bother him at all. Twice, she'd gone as far as to ask him if he needed to be changed, but when he'd answered no both times, she'd said okay and dropped the subject. The next week came and went without so much as a peep from Mrs. Warren, even after the trash was hauled away. Doug was overjoyed. He'd done it. He'd outsmarted her, and had accomplished this task in the most important of situations. This, of course, meant that he could do it again, and again, probably, though he didn't want to push his luck. Every week or two would have to be enough, though he wanted far more. But the consequences of being found out were too dire. Not only would he get another fearsome spanking, he thought, but he'd lose this, one of maybe two bright spots in his current life. He desperately needed this system for his release, so he had to be very careful. And with any luck, it was now finally conceivable to him that he could actually complete this hellish 6 months of babyhood. It was now Friday of the 4th week, and Doug had thus completed a month of his ICP. Not much was happening around the lab, so Doug took the opportunity to walk home for a leisurely lunch in the privacy of his apartment, where a diaper change was less of a hassle. A month, he thought as he walked home. It seemed impossible that he'd spent a whole month as a baby, but it was true. He hadn't been out of a diaper for more than 15 minutes at all, and hadn't used a toilet the whole time. He wasn't enjoying it, certainly, but he was getting used to it a little. He was definitely still enjoying the convenience diapers offered. He hardly thought about when he peed these days, as much trouble as cleanup was. He loved not worrying about holding it in until he got to a bathroom. He didn't think that carefully about it, because it didn't seem important to him, but if he had, he would have noticed that he still had to consciously relax his bladder and bowels to empty them. But he was doing it far more often and instinctively. There were lots of things he still didn't like, however. He hated limiting himself to one orgasm a week, but he wanted to be very conservative about that, especially at first. He had a good system, but he knew that Mrs. Warren was smart, and if he blew it he might never figure out another feasible system. It was too precious. Most of all, however, he hated subjugating himself to Mrs. Warren, acting like a 2-year-old around her. He was still very self-conscious about having to call her Mommy, and it galled him to have to walk on eggshells around to show her how obedient he was. The only thing that kept him doing it was the knowledge that if he didn't, he'd get something which pleased him even less, a spanking. And so, even though he was constantly humiliated by the fact that he really was literally trying to be a good little boy to avoid a spanking from his mommy, it was worth it to him to do so. Doug continued to be frustrated by not figuring a way out of this mess. It was beginning to look more and more like he'd have to ride the thing out for the full duration of the 6 months. This failure was in itself embarrassing, but he was beginning to see the wisdom in not fighting Mrs. Warren. These last few weeks had been degrading, of course, but nothing like his experience with the wet bed that day. And without a spanking since then, the time had passed more quickly, too. If he could just ride this out for another 5 months and stay on Mrs. Warren's good side, which meant being a good boy, he could count on resuming his normal life in April without so much as a single spanking before that. This plan, because of its relative ease and safety, was becoming more and more attractive to him. With his secret masturbation scheme in place, he could almost imagine making it that long. His musings ended as he arrived home and started to make his lunch. His diaper was soaked, he'd made it through the morning without a change, but he was hungry, so he put off changing himself until after lunch. He had just finished making a sandwich when he was surprised by the sound of a key in the lock of his front door. Mrs. Warren, he thought. Was he in trouble? She didn't ordinarily visit him during work days, even when he was home for lunch. Doug, he heard her call from the hall. Yes, Mommy, he answered, gritting his teeth slightly at the humiliation of having to call her that. We need to talk, Mrs. Warren told him as she entered his living room, with him following closely behind. I called your machine, Doug said defensively, hoping to head off any problems. I told you I was coming home for lunch. Oh, yes, that was a good boy, Mrs. Warren said, sitting down and putting her keys in her big black purse, which seemed to be more full than usual. That's how I knew to find you here. No, that's not what this is about. Was I bad? Doug asked worriedly. After he'd just considered how lucky he was for not having been spanked recently, this seemed a big disappointment. Could she know about his secret? But surely she'd appear much angrier if she knew. Well, no, I don't think so, she replied, unless you purposefully turned in too few messy diapers last week. No, he stammered. I didn't mean to, are you sure? His mind raced. What was the punishment for that? Yes, I'm sure, she said sharply. And don't question me again. My inspectors told me about it this morning after analyzing your diapers from last week. You only turned in 7 messy diapers when you were supposed to turn in 9. Oh, Doug said. He'd thought he'd done okay last week. The big question was, did he get a spanking for that? I don't know what happened. I'm really sorry, he started. Well, I'm sure it wasn't intentional. Your total number of diapers was fine, so we know you were good about using your diapers. So you don't need a spanking, she reassured him. But I am worried that you seem to be slightly constipated. Do you know why I'd care about that? No, Mommy, Doug said, though he was thinking, because you're intrusive and perverted. Well, constipation is actually a cause of a special kind of incontinence called overflow incontinence. So we always have to make sure our clients stay very regular. That's why we have the messy diaper quota, you know. Oh, he said to be polite. He wasn't constipated, and he wasn't really interested. 7 dirty diapers was pretty regular, for goodness sake. And that's why any time you turn in too few messy diapers, as you did, we want to make sure it doesn't become a problem. Whatever, Doug thought. What the hell was the point of this? He wasn't constipated, though he was very hungry by now. He needed to move her along so he could eat and get back to lunch. Okay, well, I'll try to pay more attention this week, he said, hoping that was what she was looking for. It wasn't. Not so fast, little guy, Mrs. Warren said, smiling. You obviously don't remember your rule list. We need to spend the next day or so making sure you aren't at all, shall we say, plugged up. Doug didn't like the sound of that. I call it bowel encouragement. Does that ring any bells? Doug shook his head, beginning to dread the answer. He hoped it wasn't diaper juice. Well, we just help you along a little by putting something in your bottom every so often for a day. It's guaranteed to work. Well, out of everything that could be happening, that didn't sound too bad. Still, he wasn't sure he could trust Mrs. Warren. Does it hurt? No, not really, she replied. Let's go get you started. Have you had a bowel movement today? No, Mommy, Doug answered. He had himself on a nice regular evening schedule for BMs during the week. Mrs. Warren smiled with anticipation. That's fine. Let's go upstairs and get you changed into a dry diaper. I see that one's about soaked. Doug looked down, but saw no signs of leaking through his pants. He was amazed at how Mrs. Warren could tell these things so accurately. I mean, I'm wearing pants, he thought. Is my diaper still that obvious? Can everyone tell? Or is she just that good? Mrs. Warren led him upstairs, aware of the impact a comment would make on Doug's confidence in public and on his opinion of her. In truth, she simply had seen him arrive home and assumed he'd not yet changed himself. After a whole morning at work, she'd knew he had to be soaking. With considerable embarrassment, Doug lay back on his changing pad and allowed his pants to be pulled down and his diaper changed. Mrs. Warren didn't do this for him often, and he was still self-conscious enough about it to make the experience painful. Mrs. Warren ran a baby wipe around his diaper area, cleaning his hairless groin carefully. Very nice job shaving, Doug, she said. You're turning into a very good little baby for Mommy. If we can get this constipation problem cleared up, we might consider taking you off of probation in a month or 2. Probation. He'd forgotten he was on probation. Recently it hadn't been that bad being on probation, he reflected, as Mrs. Warren placed a clean diaper under his hips and powdered him heavily. But if he could be off of probation, then maybe he wouldn't be spied on at work, or maybe his garbage wouldn't be sorted, or his diapers counted. Then he could really get away with stuff. He tried to busy himself thinking how nice that would be while Mrs. Warren finished readying him. His attention was redirected back to Mrs. Warren as she dug into her purse and retrieved a latex glove and a small unlabeled container, from which she removed 2 cone-shaped pellets. After donning the glove, she had Doug spread and lift his legs, after which she unceremoniously stuck the 2 pellets up past Doug's anus, well into his rectum. Doug was caught off guard by this new experience, and he sucked in his breath sharply, unconsciously also clamping down his sphincter in self-defense. This effort had no effect on Mrs. Warren's finger, which had accomplished its mission and retreated quickly. Mrs. Warren had his diaper taped up before Doug even knew what was happening. His bottom felt a little funny with those things inside, but it didn't hurt or anything. Doug was relieved. That was it. She had him stand up as she walked over to his dresser and removed from the top drawer a pair of his white plastic panties. She handed them to Doug and told him to put them on, which he did. Then she went back to her purse and, to Doug's surprise, removed from it another pair of plastic panties. These, too, Doug obediently pulled on, wondering idly what the point of 2 pairs of panties was. He noted as he adjusted the waist that there was something unusual about the elastic band, but before he had even realized that there was a small chain embedded in the waistband, Mrs. Warren had reached over and snapped closed a tiny padlock. Doug looked up in surprise. Why did he need to be locked in? But Mrs. Warren just smiled and said, "There you go. Now, here's the plan. After a while you're going to want to soil your diaper. I know you're incontinent, but my advice to you is to try to hold it in for at least an hour and a half. The reason for that is that I want these suppositories to stay inside you and melt completely. If you just poop them out now, they won't help you at all. So the rule is, keep them in until they're melted completely. You won't be able to tell, of course, but an hour and a half should do the trick. I'm going to check your diaper when I change it in 6 hours, and if I find any part of the suppository unmelted, I'll know you didn't get the full effect. If that happens, we go directly to enemas, which you will like even less. So for your comfort, I'd like to try the suppositories first." Actually it was less for his comfort than it was to draw out the entire affair. Enemas were over too quickly. Every 6 hours, I'll come here and unlock you, let you shower if you need to, and put you in a clean diaper with 2 more suppositories. In 24 hours, after 4 messy diapers, I'll assume you're no longer constipated, and you can get back to your regular life, no pun intended. Okay. Walk me downstairs, she said brightly as she picked up her purse. Wearing nothing but his diaper and plastic panties, Doug accompanied her to the front door. I have to tell you, Doug, that as important as this treatment is, I know you'll appreciate my help over the next day. I'd like to hear you thank me for that help every time I see you through tomorrow. She looked at Doug expectantly. Thank you, Mommy, Doug said quickly, though he wasn't sure he meant it. At his response, Mrs. Warren smiled a wonderfully evil smile, said goodbye, and left his apartment, telling him she'd be back at 6. Doug looked down at his bulky diaper, now encased in 2 pairs of plastic panties. He started to get a foreboding that the next day wasn't going to be very enjoyable for him. He'd actually never heard of suppositories, but he hoped they didn't work very quickly, because he had to work this afternoon. There wasn't much to do, just a couple of essays in the lab, but they were timed, and he had to be there all day, until nearly 6 o'clock, to supervise them. What if he had a bowel movement at work? He had purposely avoided this until now, knowing that the smell would be hideous and difficult to control. He stared at the 2 pairs of panties he wore and felt a chill up his spine as he realized that they must be there for a reason. He was probably being set up for a disaster. Damn that woman, he thought. She must know the effect this might have. She was doing it on purpose. And now he was locked in. He couldn't escape this at all now, judging by the double protection she'd given him. He was destined to have an enormous accident in a potentially embarrassing place, and there was no way to avoid it. He wanted desperately to expel those little pellets right now, before they could do whatever they were going to do. But that would apparently lead to an enema, which didn't sound nice at all, and if he knew Mrs. Warren at all, probably a spanking as well. No, he didn't have a choice. As bad as this day might get, he knew he had to face it. A glance at his watch told him that this escapade had already nearly made him late for getting back to the lab. So he wolfed down his sandwich and tried to find pants to cover himself, now that he was bigger than ever before. He got his longest shirt and tried it on. It seemed to disguise his diapered state, but when he walked, it tightened against his diaper with every move and made things very obvious, he thought. But that was the best he could do. He had to hurry. He got to his lab without having anyone comment on or stare at him, so he started to feel better about the afternoon still ahead of him. Until he sat down for the first time and suddenly felt a cramp in his belly. Oh, he thought. It's already starting? He hadn't expected it to be quite this fast-acting. It had only been about 30 minutes since Mrs. Warren had inserted the suppositories. He sat at his desk and tried to concentrate on other things, but soon Doug could think of nothing but his bowels. He heard a familiar gurgling in his stomach, the same gurgling he'd heard a month ago in his bathtub. This was when he knew that this situation would get much worse before it would get better. He was again filled with the desire to push those angry pellets out into his diaper where they couldn't hurt him, but still he resisted the urge. He wanted to get through this without making it any worse. The pain and urgency in his bottom got much worse when he got up 20 minutes later to turn off a gel he'd been running. He literally had to clench his teeth as he stood working so as not to soil himself. By this point the contents of his intestines were screaming to be let loose, but Doug was now determined to go the distance. If he gave in to his urges now, on top of all of the misery he'd already endured over the last hour, he'd also probably be spanked and subjected to an enema. A co-worker came in several minutes later, and Doug tried to stay still, so as not to move and thereby give away his diapered status. But his friend noticed his obvious discomfort, and suggested he take the afternoon off. Doug nodded grimly but didn't say anything. He knew that wasn't really an option. If he went home sick, he'd have to tell Mrs. Warren, whose remedy might be worse yet. To his relief his co-worker simply shook his head and left. Doug was sweating by the time 90 minutes were up. But he was elated, he had done it, and now he could relieve himself of this torment. Yet it wasn't much of a victory, he knew, as he was now simply given the unenviable opportunity to mess his diaper at work and then stay in it for 4.5 uncomfortable hours. His discomfort would simply shift to outside his body, with the added risk of someone discovering him. He was trapped and silently cursed Mrs. Warren again. He was beginning to realize, in part, how diabolical she could be. A minute later, when the next round of cramps struck him, he realized it didn't matter what he wanted or who was to blame. As he nearly cried out in agony, he instinctively squatted down and urgently pushed what he could of his intestinal contents out into his diaper. And his bowels responded explosively. Doug couldn't help but enjoy the sensation, momentarily luxuriating in the absence of pain and pressure. When he could, he stood up again and looked around. The lab room was empty, thank goodness. That experience had gone unwitnessed. But now what? How to hide the very full state of his pants? Doug made the unfortunate decision to sit down to think, and immediately wished he hadn't. He felt his diaper's contents squish and spread over his bottom and between his legs. This was indeed a mess. Once seated, though, Doug realized that if he stayed that way and didn't move, the smell wasn't too bad. So he just spent the rest of his day parked in his dirty diaper at his desk, periodically relieving himself as he needed, feeling no compunction to hold it in now. Luckily, most people seemed to have taken off early on this Friday afternoon, and he had only 2 further visitors to his lonely lab, neither requiring him to stand. He couldn't believe his luck, if you could call it that, but after the rest of the day he'd had, he was grateful for any break he could get. He listened for the familiar and distant sounds of keys jingling and doors shutting as the rest of the employees left for the day. When all was quiet, at about 5:30, Doug gingerly stood, picked up his relatively useless diaper bag, and waddled out of his lab. Doug's fear of being smelled on the bus convinced him to walk home, an uncomfortable trip that contrasted vividly with his walk to work this noon. Now, with every step he felt the largely liquid load in his diaper shift and squish, and the discomfort only increased over the 15 minutes it took to get home. The only good thing was that it was nearly 6 when he arrived home, and he only had to wait a couple minutes for Mrs. Warren to show up. He couldn't wait. It had indeed been a miserable afternoon, from start to finish. With the exception of his continence test, he'd never been so uncomfortable in his life, he'd never had such a full diaper, and he'd never had to wear a messy diaper for so long. He was thoroughly disgusted, and ready as never before for a clean diaper. Mrs. Warren was, as always, punctual, and unlocked the outer plastic panties immediately. She watched with an amused smile as he pulled them off. They were obviously dirty on the inside, a sign that his accident had overloaded his thick diaper and the first pair of plastic pants. Doug's gratitude for the necessary protection this afternoon was tempered by the confirmation that Mrs. Warren had known exactly what would happen to him today. She tried to play it off as concern for his incontinence, but Doug was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Warren was enjoying his unhappiness. This was such a frightening thought that he pushed it temporarily from his mind. He remained conscious only of a desire to end his ICP at the end of the 6 months. While thinking, he also pulled the other panties off and untaped his loaded diaper. "Phew. That is a dirty diaper," she said, chuckling. Doug didn't share her good humor, for he was also embarrassed for her to see him in such a humiliating state, but he reminded himself that it had happened before. And like before, his mind was primarily thinking of getting cleaned up. He waddled carefully into the bathroom and showered, leaving his filthy diaper with Mrs. Warren to examine. She did, noting the absence of any remaining, unmelted suppository. That was a little disappointing to her for several reasons. It deprived her of the opportunity to enemize Doug, which she knew she'd enjoy. More importantly, however, it meant that he was still continent enough of bowel to hold significant pressure in for a long time. But she remembered that all of her boys, most of whom were perfectly on schedule, usually did fine for the first round. It was rounds 2 and 3, which for Doug would come overnight tonight, when their increasingly unconditioned sphincters gave way and allowed their contents out before 90 minutes were up. Exactly when the boys' control failed during this difficult day of bowel torture gave her important information regarding their progress, and this was the major reason that she put her babies through this rectal hell. Doug took his time in the shower, enjoying the sensation of being out of a diaper for a few minutes. His relief at having escaped the day's earlier torment was all-consuming. He savored the feeling, and couldn't really think about anything else. And this preoccupation with the present, like every other part of Doug's incontinence control program, was planned by Mrs. Warren. She had discovered that the more her clients were focused on detailed rules and demands, the less capable they were of seeing the bigger picture. Doug rightfully thought today's experience was horrendous, but because it took all of his concentration simply to make it through the day, he couldn't spend any time considering the larger purpose for the ordeal, which was to assess his progress toward incontinence. He was trying only to make it through each day without a spanking. Had he known the stakes, he might have shifted his efforts toward avoiding Mrs. Warren's long-term plans for him. But Doug was so focused at the moment, in fact, that he was completely shocked and dismayed when he emerged from the shower and saw another 2 pellets waiting for him in Mrs. Warren's gloved hand. He'd forgotten that he had more to endure. "No, please, Mommy," he whined. His bowels already ached. "I'm all cleaned out, I promise." "Shush, Mrs. Warren said, pushing Doug back on his changing pad. "No more backtalk. You'll be done soon enough. We have to make sure." Doug compliantly spread and lifted his legs, allowing himself to be powdered, invaded by the glycerine, and re-diapered. Mrs. Warren had 2 clean plastic panties for Doug to put on. Doug watched helplessly as she locked the outer one. He knew better than to object. "Do I have to wait 6 whole hours?" he asked, pushing Mrs. Warren as far as he dared. "Absolutely." She packed up her purse. "But it's so long in a messy diaper," he whimpered. Mrs. Warren glared at him. "That's enough, young man. Look at it this way, this is making up for all the time you didn't spend in dirty diapers this week. Remember, now, same rules, if you don't want an enema. Try to wait 90 minutes, and I'll see you around midnight. I'll wake you up if I need to. Now, I suggest you have some dinner." She left, and Doug waddled downstairs to eat. This time, though his bowels were nearly empty, they were also still very irritated from the previous suppositories, and they reacted quickly and strongly to this new onslaught of glycerine. The cramps and discomfort started within 5 to 10 minutes, and Doug nearly cried several times. This was so pathetic. He wanted nothing more than to control his own bowels, and he felt degraded, angry, and miserable that he wasn't allowed to make his own decision about such elementary functions. Mrs. Warren would have been happy that his greatest desire tonight was craving the ability to mess his diaper when he wanted. Life for Doug had certainly changed. But once again he bumped up against that wall he now always faced, Mrs. Warren and her absolute power over him. Though his ego still rejected his current impotent situation, he knew he had to force himself to submit to her difficult will. So he gritted his teeth and tried to keep his diaper clean. Meanwhile, while his bowels churned away, he unconsciously, and vainly, searched for a way to rationalize his participation in this absurd ICP. If he could gain something, anything, out of this humiliating return to diaperhood, his self-esteem wouldn't suffer as much. Perhaps, he allowed himself to think, Mrs. Warren had actually been right, and he had always been a little incontinent. That would make all of this worthwhile, and this pain a little more tolerable. If this were so, then he was in the right hands, and he should just relax and trust in Mrs. Warren's experience with such matters. But even as he allowed himself to think this way, he knew it wasn't true. Mrs. Warren was mean to him. His defensive ego was playing tricks on him, and that's probably just what Mrs. Warren wanted to happen. He shook his head. He hadn't been incontinent. Probably. He didn't think so. But it seemed like things were more confusing these days, which frightened him a little in a vague way. He was, as always, able to reassure himself that, at the very least, it would all end in 5 months, and he could return to normality. There was still a finite end to this nonsense, a light at the end of the tunnel. Doug's second vigil of the day ended just over an hour in, when he decided that maybe an hour really was enough to melt those little pellets, and that waiting longer would hurt too much. Plus, he started to admit to himself, he was getting tired of holding it in, he wasn't used to such a strain. For the last 4 weeks, he hadn't tried to hold it in at all, now he had diarrhea and was expected to hold it in all day long. No one could do that, he thought to himself, practicing some dangerous denial. He regarded his task as superhuman, and something of which anyone would tire. So once again Doug filled his diaper with loose, brown, sticky poop, and he sighed and grimaced as he sat down in it to watch TV until Mrs. Warren returned at midnight. He decided to try to ignore his messy state, and, in fact, he was beginning to grow used to it. His acclimation to such infantile discomfort showed the effect this month had had on him. Mrs. Warren would have again been pleased. And she was. At midnight, Mrs. Warren arrived and found Doug asleep on the sofa in his filthy diaper, and she smiled. She gently woke him, guided him as he sleepily headed upstairs, and helped him remove his panties and diaper. This time Mrs. Warren found what she was looking for in Doug's diaper. 2 small suppository remnants told her Doug was unable to maintain good sphincter tone for 90 minutes tonight. She was thrilled, but decided to put off Doug's enema until the morning, when they would both be more awake, for the benefit of her heightened enjoyment and his increased misery. She didn't want either one of them to sleep through it. Doug showered more quickly this time, realizing that there was no virtue in putting off the inevitable. It would just make everything last longer. He dried himself, and, still naked, headed back to his bedroom, where another diaper was waiting for him, as well as Mrs. Warren, who had 2 more suppositories ready. He groaned as she inserted them with a gloved finger, and then he obediently allowed her to tape him up and lock him in still another plastic panty. Mrs. Warren saw his exhaustion and beaten spirit and couldn't resist a smile. Halfway there, Doug. 12 more hours. He grunted in return. He was tired physically and mentally, and her encouragement couldn't help him. Sleep well. I'll be here a little late, at about 7 o'clock, so that I don't have to wake you too early, she said, stroking his hair gently. Thank Mommy, and tell her good night. Good night, Mommy, Doug wearily replied. And thanks, he said unconvincingly. Mrs. Warren had scarcely driven away when Doug felt his bowel cramp for the first time. He groaned and rolled over in bed, still feeling very sleepy but knowing that he should stay awake for a while. When this round of cramps subsided several minutes later, however, he quickly drifted off to sleep. In its weakened and exhausted state, Doug's rectal sphincter was no match for the pressure of its contents as they built over the next 15 minutes. And Mrs. Warren would therefore have loved to have seen the moment, not half an hour after she placed the suppositories, when Doug soiled himself in his sleep for the first time in more than 20 years. He didn't even stir when it happened, and was so used to wearing messy diapers, and so tired from the events of the previous day, that he never awoke, and thus was surprised when Mrs. Warren had to shake him awake at 7 the next morning. Was Dougie a good little baby last night? Mrs. Warren asked sweetly when Doug's eyes finally fluttered open. Yes, Mommy, Doug said reflexively, before he had time to think about whether it was true. He sat up and knew instantly that he was messy. But when had it happened? Well, let's see, shall we? Mrs. Warren unlocked his panties and helped Doug pull them down his legs. Then they untaped his diaper, and Doug looked with curiosity down between his legs to his clean-shaven groin, and the diaper underneath. It contained a little bit of poop and 2 well-formed glycerine pellets which hadn't even come close to melting. Doug caught his breath. Had he fallen asleep? He stuttered a few unintelligible syllables before Mrs. Warren cut him off. That's enough. Looks like maybe we weren't quite as good a little boy as we thought. Head on in there and take your shower if you want, and we'll talk about it afterward. Doug complied, shaking his head in confusion. How did that happen? He wondered. And now what would she do? She has to be kidding about the enema, that's absurd, I've never had one of those and I'm not going to start now, he thought, even as he knew that Mrs. Warren didn't break her promises. But it's so drastic. Maybe she won't make me. But when he returned to his bedroom, of course, there was a large clean bag of soapy liquid hanging from one of his bedposts, with a long tube snaking its way down to his changing pad. Mrs. Warren was holding a container of KY jelly and looking at him expectantly. Doug, I'd like for you to lay down here for a minute. Doug was scared. Mrs. Warren, I mean, Mommy, do we have to? I mean, I'll just try again with those suppository things. Please. Oh, don't worry. We still have one more try with those. But first I'd just like for you to come over here and lie down. Just for a minute. He knew now that he couldn't escape it, so he slowly approached the bed. That's a good boy. On your hands and knees, like a puppy dog, with your bottom down here. Good boy. Now drop to your elbows and put your head down. And spread your legs a little. Perfect. Doug closed his eyes. He felt a slippery finger touch his bottom, and then felt a small firm object invading him. He involuntarily tried to clamp down against it but couldn't. He heard a click as Mrs. Warren released the valve on the tubing to allow 2 liters of sudsy warm water to fill his bowels. Doug then felt a warmth in his abdomen and an unusual, nondescript feeling as well. Doug was happy to learn that it didn't really hurt at all. It lasted for what seemed quite a while. Finally, the plastic object was removed from his bottom. Not that bad, Doug thought. Mrs. Warren said, "Okay, now just hold still for a minute." As Doug waited, he felt gurgling throughout his abdomen and wondered what would happen next. Mrs. Warren was considering whether or not to use the tampon at this point. She decided first to test Doug's sphincter further. There would be time for the tampon later, and this could be fun. She had tried butt plugs in the past, but tampons did the same job and seemed to embarrass her boys even more. Get up now, Doug. He stood and found Mrs. Warren waiting with a pair of transparent plastic panties, which she helped him pull up his legs. Two rules. First, you may not sit or lie down while holding an enema. It's medically dangerous, she lied. She'd learned that it was harder for her babies to hold it in while standing. Second, to get maximum benefit, you should hold it in for 20 minutes. After that, we'll put a diaper back on you and let you empty. These panties are just in case of an accident, but I certainly don't expect you to need them. Okay, now run along. I suggest you make yourself some breakfast. Doug nodded and headed downstairs as Mrs. Warren followed. He was feeling extremely self-conscious of his essentially naked state, and also of the weird feeling of plastic next to his skin. On the other hand, he thought 20 minutes would be no problem, compared with the hour and a half of suppository hell. Mrs. Warren sat down in the living room as Doug poured himself some cereal. Suddenly he got an unpleasant feeling in his belly. It was sort of vague when it started, but it made him call into Mrs. Warren to ask what would happen just in case he couldn't hold it for 20 minutes. What usually happens when you break one of my rules, she called back. I'll give you a hint, it involves my lap in your bottom. Doug rolled his eyes in response, careful not to let Mrs. Warren see him do it. Everything was spankings with this lady. Suddenly Doug was dropped to his knees by a huge abdominal cramp and the strongest urge to defecate he'd ever experienced. It was urgent and commanding in a way that even the diaper juice and the suppositories weren't. He simply couldn't stop it. He moaned as his tortured bowels ejected the enema into his transparent panties. Mrs. Warren ran in from the living room when she heard his yelp, and upon reaching the kitchen door, stood and enjoyed the view as the water and stool graphically filled his panties. The spasm relented for a moment, and Doug tried to catch his breath. What was that? He was dazed. He tried to clear his head, when suddenly Mrs. Warren yanked him by his arm, forcing him to stand. Upstairs, young man. I'll teach you to respect my rules, she said angrily. I couldn't help it, he stammered. Please, it wasn't my fault. And then, again, Doug experienced cramps, cried out, and released more enema into his dripping panties. Oh, you're begging for it now, Mrs. Warren snapped, forcefully pulling him over to the stairs and dragging him up them. Wash yourself off and then get in here pronto, she told him. You've got 2 minutes to be over my knees, or you're really going to regret it. Doug was about to cry from pain, frustration, and embarrassment, but he hurried into the bathroom, carefully removed his soaking plastic panties, and stepped into the shower. He let loose another stream of enema, quickly rinsed off, then jumped out and dried himself perfunctorily. Still nude, he hurried into the bedroom, where Mrs. Warren sat stiffly in a straight-backed chair near his desk. He stopped abruptly in front of her, suddenly realizing what was about to happen. "Let's go, little boy," Mrs. Warren said. "You've only got seconds before I really get angry." So Doug bent himself awkwardly across her lap, grabbed the chair legs as he had previously been instructed, and waited. His bare bottom tingled expectantly. He hoped that she'd go easy on him, but she sounded angry. She wasn't really angry, of course. As she began to paddle his bottom with her strong hand, she was nearly gleeful about Doug's apparent progress. He'd only taken about 3 minutes, far below average in this, the most accurate gauge of actual incontinence she had developed. Most boys at this stage lasted 8 to 9 minutes, but Doug had folded quickly, evidence that he was enjoying and using his diapers properly. Wonderful news. A spanking opportunity was icing for her. And she enjoyed this icing, letting her steel hands fall sharply on Doug's reddening bottom, hearing the vain whimpers of protest dissolve into sniffles and then into outright crying. She felt a certain satisfaction as she delivered this assault. Doug wiggled helplessly, just like all the others. Grown men indeed, she thought with disdain. It was times like this that made her feel that anyone who would allow any of this to happen to himself actually deserved it. These boys, who let her take over their lives and dictate their most basic functions, who allowed her to usurp every last vestige of their independence and dignity, surely must benefit from her discipline. If they'd let themselves fall this deeply into her power, she thought, some part of them must be every bit the little baby she forced them to be. They desperately needed to be punished for their pathetic passivity. These thoughts spurred ever greater spanking effort, and she continued until she was sure Doug's bottom would be sore for several days. Then she dumped him unceremoniously on the floor, where he lay crying. She went into the bathroom and refilled the enema bag, though this time she only put 1 liter of soapy warm water, since he probably hadn't even fully expelled the last one. She forced Doug, who was now only sniffling, back on the bed and told him to lie like a puppy dog again. At this point he started crying all over again at the recognition that he would receive another enema. She smacked his bottom sharply, and he quickly resumed the position amidst his tears. She administered the enema, this time inserting the large tampon she had brought with her earlier. Doug felt the plastic removed from his bottom, but to his surprise couldn't close his anus. Something was still there, and it quickly swelled with the water from the enema, expanding and filling his anal canal completely. Doug turned his head around, hoping to see what it was, but there was nothing to see. He looked to Mrs. Warren for an explanation, and she nearly laughed out loud at his confusion. Doug didn't understand what was happening, but his bottom still stung enough that he didn't want to ask any questions, so he remained unsure of what she'd done. She made him put on another pair of transparent panties, this time just for show, since nothing would get out of his bottom this time, and led him downstairs, where he tried to finish making his breakfast. The heat from his burning bottom built up inside of his panties, making it difficult for him to concentrate. This time, when the cramps hit him, he again let out a yell and doubled over in pain, but as his intestines tried to expel the enema, they met the impenetrable resistance of the tampon, and, indeed, nothing came out. Doug was surprised and a bit upset, since the pain therefore continued unabated. The cramps eventually let up, but resumed after another minute, and by the time 20 minutes were over, Doug was crying again. He never even finished making his breakfast. Mrs. Warren gently led him upstairs and replaced his panties with one of his disposable diaper. He had never been so overjoyed to get into one. Mrs. Warren reached down the back of his diaper with a gloved hand and pulled the tampon string, gently working it out of Doug's bottom. She withdrew her hand as quickly as possible, leaving the tampon behind, since she knew from experience that the client's anal sphincter was probably totally worthless at this point of the exercise. And sure enough, a liter of liquid immediately and uncontrollably gushed out into Doug's diaper. So again Mrs. Warren changed Doug, who was nearly catatonic after everything he'd been through. He didn't put up any resistance and probably wouldn't have even noticed the fact that she inserted the last 2 suppositories before taping him up again, except that she pointed it out and told him to try not to poop for 90 minutes. After locking him one final time into the panties, she finally left for the morning, not to return until afternoon. Doug was not surprised to feel the pellets ooze helplessly out of his bottom into his diaper less than 15 minutes later. He didn't care. He went to sleep. Not even his sore, hot bottom could interfere with his exhaustion. When Mrs. Warren returned 6 hours later, she told Doug once again to clean himself up, which he did. Doug was remotely upset when Mrs. Warren told him that they weren't done yet, that he needed one more enema before it was all over, since he hadn't melted these pellets either. But he had run out of emotion, and felt his misery only dully now. For 20 minutes following the administration of the enema, he did find the energy to cry, as colonic spasms shook him repeatedly. But then it was over, and Mrs. Warren cleaned and re-diapered him, told him to count his messy diapers from now on, and then left him alone. Finally, he sat numbly on his sofa, relieved to be wearing nothing but a nice, fresh diaper. His bowels felt totally worn out. He couldn't believe what had happened to him over the past day, so he just tried to block it out and watch TV. 5 months, he thought. 5 months.